Out of all the classic id shooters, Quake is by far the least discussed. Doom's incredibly successful reboot and even faster-paced sequel has solidified the fame of that series for a whole new generation. Wolfenstein reinvented itself even more boldly as a primarily story-driven franchise. The 4 Quake titles have evaded modern interpretation. Rather than being rebooted or remade, the older Quakes have instead been painstakingly remastered, trying to preserve their original look and intention as much as possible while making them more accessible for modern audiences. I have sort of wanted to cover the Quake games for years. Quake 2 was a huge part of my childhood, but Quake 1 was not. For those reasons, I bounced off of Quake 3 and I loved Quake 4, but it had been almost 2 decades since I played some of these games. Was it even really worth going back? The modern remastering has given me the push I needed to find out. They're not exactly the same games, but they are improved in subtle and clever ways that don't conflict at all with what I enjoyed about them in the first place so many years ago. If nothing else, things like radial wheel selection for items and weapons just allow the games to move faster. And I'm so glad that I did come back. The Quake games are fascinating because while Doom and Wolfenstein all made relatively sensible and steady leaps into the future with their sequels, each Quake title represents a point of transition for id as a company, artistically contorted to be a game for a given moment and not to stand the test of time. Time, then, has largely ignored them. They are frozen moments from the earliest primordial days of 3D gaming that still tell the tale if you go down deep enough into the cave to shine a light on them. What I've always treasured most in game design is narrative immersion, a good reason for being there, a compelling set of goals. Quake 1 and 3 don't have those things at all, and Quake 2 and 4 have those things somewhat awkwardly, learning experiences in the process of merging theater with technology. In terms of identity, I can hardly think of a game franchise whose titles are so chaotically contrasting in both presentation and intention. That confused me as a kid, but as a game critic, this same chaos is just intoxicating. What does it mean? Can it be made to somehow cohere? Is there any kind of narrative through line to follow at all? Quake as a pure action challenge doesn't really appeal to me that much. That's largely why Quake 1 was never a part of my life, even when a game like Doom was, because Doom did make a kind of narrative sense. It even had a novelization, although both book and game are as simple as they are bloodthirsty from a storytelling perspective. I could never figure out what to make of Quake. I still don't think I've got the whole of it, because I'm not the kind of person who's able to play shooters on their maximum difficulty and master them. I feel plenty of pressure on medium or normal. The most subtle aspects of the mechanical experience are lost on me, flailing around making clumsy mistakes where staying alive is more about luck than skill for me much of the time, which makes me, in the eyes of many viewers, completely unqualified to discuss games at all as a medium, and if there was any justice in the world, I wouldn't even be allowed to talk about them. But there is no justice, and there is no Santa Claus, so I critique as I please. I'm going to tackle the Quake series from a narrative perspective, and there's nothing you fuckers can do to stop me. The most important story there is in my understanding of Quake 1 comes not from the manual, but from Masters of Doom by David Kushner, an absolutely tremendous biographical book about John Carmack, John Romero, and id's rise to prominence in pop culture as a game development studio. Published all the way back in 2003, the book is still one of the most vivid and readable deep dives into the personalities and processes of game development ever written. Quake features within the book as the middle turn of the dramatic structure, the last game that the two Johns worked on together, the game that heralded the end of classic id as both a company and a concept. The book frames the game's inception like this, quote, "The development of every id game began with Carmack telling the other guys what his next graphic engine would be capable of. When Carmack first described his vision of the Quake technology, Romero nearly combusted. They'd all talked about doing Quake, after all, for years. The idea came straight out of their old Dungeons & Dragons games. Quake was the character Carmack had invented, who possessed a powerful hammer capable of destroying buildings, as well as a supernatural conjuring object, the Hellgate Cube, floating above his head. id had first worked on a Quake game back in the early Commander Keen days, but gave up because they felt the technology was not powerful enough yet. Now, Carmack said, the time had come." End quote. So for a year, Romero and the rest of the team besides Carmack worked on art and level design for a fantasy game based off of elements and fragments of their old long-ended D&D session, while Carmack worked fiendishly like a real-world wizard on a technology for 3D rendering that was more advanced than anything else yet programmed, globally. Quake's 3D engine was world-changing technology, and yet to be a game, and not just a technology, This engine would need to be married to some sort of artistic intention. The team felt Romero's time-spanning, fantasy-influenced, crushingly ambitious ideas were a poor fit, a time sink. Romero would later take many of his design goals for Quake 1 and update them into his new vision for a game called Daikatana. But that, as they say, is a story for another time. Before that split, while the two Johns were still working together on Quake, there was a fateful office meeting where the idea was floated that they should abandon the Dungeons & Dragons fantasy aspects. Level designer American McGee said, quote, "I think it'll be better if we make a game with rocket launchers and stuff like that," end quote. To which another level designer named Sandy Peterson replied, quote, "Yeah, let's do Doom 3, and then the next game we'll do something innovative," end quote. The choice was made. Space Marines again. But the majority of work had already been done using the fantasy style. So id just merged and blended the two styles, winging it, with one level designer per world for each of the 4 primary chapters of Quake 1, for the most part. Romero and Carmack's working relationship deteriorated considerably in the weeks following the choice to abandon Romero's designs. Towards the end, it was decided that Romero's levels wouldn't even be used for World 1, the shareware distribution version of the game. Newcomer Tim Willits got that honor instead. Carmack told Romero flatly, quote, "Tim's levels are more cohesive," end quote. This story is the key to making any sense of the game at all. It is a fantasy game deliberately and apathetically subsumed by a science fiction shooter. It is 4 worlds of levels made by level designers who are intensely competitive with each other, working crunch hours in unpleasant conditions. Quake 1 has neither narrative nor artistic cohesion because it is the result of artists working at odds with each other instead of in parallel. Contentious, jagged, idiosyncratic, Quake 1 is such a strange and raw thing that it would be essentially unmarketable in a modern context. When the full version came out on July 22, 1996, it escaped these judgments because there was no context. Nothing quite like Quake had ever existed before. And nothing would ever quite be the same again either, now that gaming had truly crossed the threshold into 3 full dimensions. If Quake 1 can be said to have a story of its own, separate from its developmental history, the themes are uncannily similar. It is a game explicitly about exploring new dimensions, how unreality bleeds into reality at these points of magical transition. There's an official story, kind of. It was literally thrown into the manual at the last moment. It has no real bearing on how the game was designed or what the game experientially is. The manual says that you're a soldier, and at 4:30 in the morning, you're called in to listen to some emergency exposition. Quote, "An enemy codenamed Quake is using his own slipgates to insert death squads inside our bases to kill, steal, and kidnap. The hell of it is we have no idea where he's from. Our top scientists think Quake's not from Earth, but from another dimension. They say Quake's preparing to unleash his real army, whatever that is. You're our best man. This is Operation Counter-Strike and you're in charge. Find Quake and stop him, or it. You have the full authority to requisition anything you need. If the eggheads are right, all our lives are expendable," end quote. It then immediately pivots to one single paragraph of framing. Quote, "While scouting the neighborhood, you hear shots back at the base. Damn, that Quake bastard works fast. You heard about Operation Counter-Strike and hit first. Racing back, you see the place is overrun. You are almost certainly the only survivor. Operation Counter-Strike is over, except for you," end quote. The whole thing is kind of funny in how apathetic it is as a story. It's like 4 cliches stapled together with a shrug and a belch to follow. You're our best man. You can have anything you need, except you never receive any help and are always alone. Quake, that fast-working bastard, is about to unleash an army, whatever that is, because even the developers didn't fucking know. In an interview with YouTube documentary series NoClip, Tim Willits talked about the change in story and how the all-new enemies in Quake 2 was a deliberate attempt to correct course on how chaotic and discordant the enemy list in Quake 1 ended up being. What's interesting to me is how, as utterly and spectacularly half-assed as the manual story is, there are parts of the game that are reflective of the general ideas it suggests. While dark fantasy and gothic architecture make up the bulk of the game, these are separated with an introductory level in each of the 4 worlds that is just exclusively sci-fi. You must find the dimensional slipgate and use it to enter these more surrealist realms. This is a narrative touch, but it isn't how you actually begin. Quake starts in an oddly fourth-wall breaking way. You begin by choosing game difficulty, but not with a menu. You choose a corridor in the environment, and it will lead you to a slightly different version of the level list. Hard is kind of the true difficulty because Quake doesn't adjust damage and health to define difficulty, it adds or subtracts enemies and puzzles as well. Hard has all the enemies and all the puzzles. Normal has all the puzzles and less of the monsters. Easy has reduced puzzles and considerably reduced enemy populations. I went for normal, and I found it plenty difficult most of the time. Once difficulty is chosen, you choose world. You can do them in any order, any modern game would just use a menu to do it, but for Quake, the engine was the point, so in creating a short interactive level instead of a game menu, the game feel becomes part of choosing even how to begin. Quake is immediate, immersive, even in difficulty selection. Each world is accessible through a dimensional portal. Whether the hub actually exists within the fiction is unclear because of the sci-fi facility levels that you always begin with within the worlds. The idea is you begin each journey in the real world of sci-fi space marines and computers, returning to the facility after collecting a rune from the end of each world and its surreal conclusions. Collect 4 runes and open the portal to the final boss, lying in wait in some strange interdimensional pocket. So there is a small amount of narrative intention in the level order, if you dig. And if you squint really hard. Each of the 4 worlds from each of the 4 level designers is completely different beyond this facility level anchor at the opening of each chapter, and even then, each facility level has a very different feel to it. The strongest sense of narrative and the most tonally consistent levels are absolutely John Romero's dark fantasy-focused ones in World 2. They're clever and often sadistically playful. There's a lot of ways to do storytelling. Traditional plot and narrative framing are just one method. Quake's levels, with such a strong sense of developer personality behind each world and chapter, do storytelling in a purely mechanical way. They establish expectations and then playfully undermine them. They create separate rhythms of progression with how and when they allow a player access to the full arsenal. Each world values the possibility of the 3D engine differently. Puzzle first or thematic level design, tricky and punishing or fair and challenging enemy placement, moody or utilitarian use of the art design. Each world stands in complementary contrast. At around 5 minutes a level, with such wide divisions between levels and level designers, the chaos of Quake 1's production becomes a larger driver of player interest than any thrown together nonsense in the game manual. I am playing the game, but I am also playing through a contrasting gallery of 4 of the earliest artists to work in 3D level design as a medium. I don't often enjoy roguelikes very much for the most part because I dislike the sense that a level was designed based on a process instead of by a person. With minimal story and an AI-assembled environment, I don't always feel like something meaningful is happening or something is being artistically communicated. Quake's levels speak. They speak in their own dark and moody language with their own internal logic, but the personality of that logic changes from world to world, from level designer to level designer. Modern level design is often such a team effort or so committed to naturalism that the sense of dialogue between player and developer is often absent. For Quake, this relationship fills the gap created by a lack of story and other tangible handholds on the game world. With no plot, no dialogue, no meaningful frame of any kind, the game still elicits strong emotional response from me. I laugh, I startle, I'm intrigued, I'm anxious, I'm aggressive. It draws these things out of me through the dialogue between game and player. Game critic Chris Franklin, whose long-running Children of Doom series is well worth watching, observed that Quake is primarily a mood piece above all. It's emotional from top to bottom, as Franklin points out, but it's tied to very teenage emotions of deep angst and prickly despondency. Romero's World 2 is the most eloquent of the 4 chapters in expressing these particular emotions of angst. So if Romero's world has the strongest personality, why was Willits given the honor of the shareware world? What made his levels more cohesive? I can't speak for Karmic, but I can speak for myself as a player. Willits levels are better as introductory levels, tonally, thematically. World 1 is perhaps less cohesive than Worlds 2 and 3, but it is simpler, more straightforward. World 1 teaches a player how to use weapons through encounter design and the order in which these weapons are introduced, and the enemy difficulty scales up more gradually throughout the level progression. Willits seems to have taken seriously the idea that a new player might be confused by the new 3D design and ought to be eased into it gradually. Romero just chucks you right off the deep end. His levels expect a person to keep up, which makes them an excellent way to separate the shareware and retail release. You've gotten the idea, now prove your work in a much more complicated and difficult circumstance. As frustrating as it may have been to Romero to be moved down the marquee in a certain way, it led to stronger and more legible game design in the product as a whole to arrange World 1 and 2 that way. The World 1 Willits levels are very clever on their own and run a wider range of aesthetics and ideas than the other worlds, showing off the possibilities of what's to come. But that's also why they don't cohere. They are a set of experiments exploring the possibilities offered, presenting a sampler platter of ideas and innovations within the 3D space, which is perhaps the best way to start things off if you're going to change the medium at large. If Willits doesn't establish a sense of a normal rhythm of play in World 1, Romero can't so cleverly undermine those expectations in his World 2. It's not narrative drama, but it is inherently and meaningfully dramatic in a player's exploration of the space given to them. Where World 2 was dark fantasy, a kind of eulogy for the game Quake was originally meant to be before it became just another game with rocket launchers and stuff, American McGee's World 3 levels establish a whole different vibe than anything that came before. They're hyper-gothic levels, taking every kind of black candle, black metal, modern gothic affectation there is, and smashing them together into the metal and marble that make up World 3's trap-filled labyrinths. World 3 is the shortest of the chapters, but it makes up for this in pure deviousness. McGee's levels are much more deliberately cruel to a player than the previous sets. There's a lot of jokes at the player's expense. Take this one, at the very end. You've come so far, fought through so much, and there lies the ruin. You get halfway across the bridge before 2 leaping enemies spawn at each end of the bridge, ready to clothesline the fuck out of the player in seconds. It completely undermines that sense of triumph in seeing the ruin by doing a Lucy with a football kind of move, reminding a player that no matter what a situation appears to be, they are never truly safe or victorious. It's just deliciously mean game design. A big part of the Quake 1 aesthetic is weird metal catwalks and lava traps, and that's all done most iconically in these levels. Romero had wanted a story-driven game originally, and while World 2 isn't story-driven, there is a casual sense to a lot of the indoor and outdoor areas. World 3 is way more abstract than that, in a much more jagged and aggressive way than the abstractions of World 1. World 3 is monochrome and dark, more confusing and labyrinthine by design. It's a step up in difficulty all around, from the encounter design to just a basic navigation. It's the monochrome aspect that creates the most friction for me. There's vast differences in the level design in terms of visual art and indoor-outdoor balance from one map to another, but the maze-like twistiness of these levels never lets up. It becomes, rather than a collection of discrete levels, a large conglomerate maze with many pieces and many processes. It just never lets up. It feels like one condensed maze, which I imagine is a plus for most players who, especially at the time, were more likely to be die-hard studio fans than bright-eyed newcomers. The newer Dooms have largely embraced that sense of relentlessness, but emphasize it with encounter design more than level design. Compared to McGee's World 3, any given Doom Eternal level is an absolute breeze to navigate and find your way through. Modern game design in general, outside of indie revivals who embrace it deliberately, has grown tired of the labyrinth. And I'm sorry to say that I have too. To be permanently lost in a world of black and purple lit by torch lamps for a cumulative hour feels exhausting. What's especially interesting is where American McGee went later in his career as a game developer. Although he was the one to say that they ought to make Quake a shooter at that fateful meeting, he would later creatively chafe against the limitations of its particular aesthetic. When given the opportunity to pursue his own creative visions, American McGee created a dark fantasy version of Alice in Wonderland that was full of all the clever variations in tone and landscape that I was missing from Quake 1. His work with id made him famous to the point that his name was on the box, American McGee's Alice. Creatively, Alice has got the same gothic focus and relentlessly dark mood, but its embrace of narrative, creating an eerie and 90s-style subversive wonderland, is so much more vibrant than Quake, so much more colorful than Quake, and especially more colorful than some of American McGee's more prominent early work. It's a cool contrast to see artists evolve in their own directions when given the chance like that. World 3 is sour, spiteful, and so, according to David Kushner's book, were the working conditions World 3 was made under. It's interesting how once this core team of developers split, they all split in such divergent directions. John Romero went on to found Ion Storm and work on his passion project. American McGee eventually found his way to his passion project as well, releasing not only Alice, but an even more creative and colorful Alice sequel called Madness Returns. Tim Willits continued to work on Quake, and the final level designer, World 4's Sandy Peterson, pursued his passion project by creating the Age of Empires strategy franchise, which I feel makes a kind of sense, because none of the other worlds were balanced with higher order strategy in mind, quite like Sandy Peterson's Elder World. There's not a huge amount of love to be found for the Elder World, and the reason for that is that it just isn't designed much around player experience. All these finicky puzzles and roundabout progression only feel sensical in hindsight. Trying to approach World 4 as an action title, fighting for my life to stay alive against monsters that murder me in just a few moments in attention, I am often stopped dead in my tracks more often than I had been before. Was it this room or that room I've been to? Was there a switch? Did I miss the switch? Did I branch all the hallways at the rotunda? Fuck, man. McGee's labyrinths didn't have wrong ways as often as they had wildly convoluted intentional paths. Peterson's labyrinths aren't nearly as legible. They are the most abstract mazes of them all by a good margin. Part of this is that World 4 has a kind of bland and disappointing art direction. There are so many corridors that all look the same, nothing to thematically break them up. The mazes are more visually varied than McGee's World 3, but only because Peterson uses level texture as wallpaper and little else. He blends this with that, without interest in tone and mood, the interest in tone and mood that defined Worlds 2 and 3. The progression is obtuse. It'll make sense after, but most often in the way where someone tells an overcomplicated joke, explains the joke to you, and then asks, you get it now, right? Right, I do, but my enthusiasm is all burnt up in the exposition. Quake can often feel like a maze full of dead ends throughout many of its worlds and levels, but the skill of the other levels is that there really often is only one way to go, and the level always loops back around on itself. World 4 is a process puzzle. It feels less fluid and more like steps I would prefer to follow if I had a repair manual. The rationale behind putting these levels last is a hope that their more abstract design will help with understanding that the final boss is a puzzle and not a combat problem. The game's only previous boss, after all, came at the end of the shareware levels back in World 1, a big lava man named Chthon. Despite the round arena, the big guy is also a puzzle boss, a pretty simple puzzle and a pretty simple boss. 2 switches each drop a metal pillar, then a third switch runs an electric current between them, electrocuting the guy. Worlds 2, 3, and 4 are designed without bosses, opting for different flavors of dirty tricks instead. The world selection screen opens a secret basement for the final encounter when you're done with them. The setup is explained by Romero's World 2 victory dialogue, quote, "You learn the inmost lore of the Hellmother, Shub-Niggurath. You now know that she is behind all the terrible plotting which has led to so much death and horror, but she is not inviolate. Armed with this rune, you realize that once all 4 runes are combined, the gate to Shub-Niggurath's pit will open and you can face the witch goddess herself in her frightful otherworld cathedral." End quote. This basically throws out anything that was written in the manual. Wasn't Quake like some guy? World 1 suggests that this is a land of Quake. World 2 reframes the whole thing as being against this inscrutable Lovecraftian witch goddess. World 3 vamps for a bit, stalling for time. Then Peterson's World 4 offers on its victory screen as many lore complications as the levels had navigational complications. Quote, "Beyond good and evil, beyond life and death, the rune pulsates, heavy with import. Patient and potent, the elder being Shub-Niggurath weaves her dire plans to clear off all life from the earth and bring her own foul offspring to our world. For all the dwellers in these nightmare dimensions are her descendants. Once all runes of magic power are united, the energy behind them will blast open the gateway to Shub-Niggurath, and you can travel there to foil the Hellmother's plots in person. You sense tremendous invisible forces moving to unseal ancient barriers. Shub-Niggurath had hoped to use the runes herself to clear off the earth, but now instead you will use them to enter her home and confront her as an avatar of avenging Earth life. If you defeat her, you will be remembered forever as the savior of the planet. If she conquers, it will be as if you had never been born. End quote. Time hopping, dimension hopping, Quake 1 is a game that embraces magical thinking as a way to stitch together ideas that simply do not fit in any rational or linear way. So you set out to destroy Quake, then we confidently pivot away from the idea that Quake is anyone or anything in particular besides the title of the game. All this disparate, chaotic, dimension-hopping madness eventually comes down to you and all shubs. What is shubs, exactly? Beyond your imagining, foolish mortal. None can intuit the meaning of its horrifying pale flesh. That's the utilitarian hat trick of claiming Lovecraftian as a legacy. You too can sidestep actually pinning down what you're talking about by emphasizing its abyssal unknowability. What Shubs is weak to is a trick from the game's deathmatch multiplayer. To most, this is the real legacy of Quake 1, and especially its modding scene. It was one of the first, most navigationally free, competitive multiplayer arenas available, designed to be that way from the ground up. The meaning people created within multiplayer felt more tangible and real to many than the moody worlds of its single-player campaign. The way to win can definitely be intuited from the level design itself, but only from familiarity with Quake multiplayer could a person immediately know that taking a portal to an occupied space kills whatever was standing there before you occupied it. At the other end of the lava pool is a device which allows you to portal to wherever a floating thingamajig happens to be. When it floats through Shubs, that's your time to strike. Quake accomplished. Whatever that means. You've defeated the armies of Quake, all without any individual part of the exposition agreeing on what Quake actually is. This boss encounter is a much more interesting puzzle than Chthon's and feels fitting enough for the idea of a weird hell being in some forsaken pocket dimension. As a level, it's equally as isolated, a pocket dimension from the style of the rest of the game as well. I have followed the narrative, and the narrative is largely only about the history of Quake 1's game development. Here at the end, I am only congratulated on beating the game. The story is already forgotten by the game itself. And yet the story continues. Twice. One of the best aspects of the remasters of Quake 1 and 2 by Nightdive Studios is that Nightdive also remastered all the official campaigns, including 2 expansions per game, the Nintendo 64 campaigns by Midway, and new content from MachineGames, who are the developers who have done such a remarkable job with the new Wolfensteins. Expansion packs from the CD-ROM era and downloadable content from the modern era are often ignored in the conversation about games as a whole, even long after all the content for a given game has been collectively released. But I love them for how they provide alternate perspectives on the original work, paths not taken, unusual and experimental connections to subsequent works. Quake 1's 2 original expansions are both of those things. They explore unused ideas and preface what comes later with Quake 2's complete reboot of the entire Quake concept. Quake 2 is an interesting example of a story-driven campaign in the era before that was such a settled concept. Its levels are interconnected within units that have discrete objectives that emulate physical places like factories and prisons. The abstraction is still there in some of the level design, maybe even much of the level design, but the wild chaos of Quake 1 is reined in to create a more believable and consistent immersion. But that didn't start with Quake 2. It actually began, hesitantly and inconsistently, with Scourge of Armagon, the first expansion pack for Quake 1. Scourge of Armagon is still largely abstract and even more arbitrarily punishing than the base campaign, but it's divided into 3 chapters that all connect in a linear way. The story from Scourge of Armagon's manual is even more focused. Quote, "The hum of a nearby computer terminal catches your attention. Peering closely at the glowing screen, you read the final orders from the base commander. It says, Quake's forces have infiltrated the weapons storage facility and are receiving reinforcements through slip gates located at the research center. All personnel are ordered to proceed with evacuation procedure EVAC 44A. Your heart sinks as you realize that the commander has ordered the base to be sealed to prevent Quake's forces from infiltrating further into our realm. All weapons and vehicles have been removed to reduce any military advantage that could be gained by taking the base. Any means of escaping or defending yourself are gone. With loss of hope comes resolution. Gritting your teeth, you decide you can either cower here waiting for Quake's forces to arrive, or you can take the battle to them, infiltrate the storage facility, and take out as many of the bastards as you can. If you were the cowering type, you wouldn't have survived as long as you have. Who knows? Maybe you can find some way of destroying the portal that allows Quake to perpetually send reinforcements." End quote. So we're back to Quake being a guy, I guess, for now. This story, as simple as it is, improves on the original by actually saying what it means and letting that inform what happens. Chapter 1 is a string of levels that all use the military facility level template. They never abandon the Space Marine theme until the end, where you actually do reach the storage facility and use the portal to reach an alternate dimension and take the fight to Quake. Simple story? Yes. Linear, actionable story? Also, surprisingly, yes. This new expansion pack was made by Hypnotic Software, later known as Ritual Entertainment, whose main claim to fame would be the shooter Sin, released a year later in 1998. Scourge of Armagon's levels are deliberately more complicated and even more deliberately aggressive than what came before. Some are exhausting, some are plain old mean, but they do at least try to cohere into actual environments, more than any of the levels in the main campaign. Take the mine level. It's very large and very vertical, beginning on the upper levels and catwalks of a mining complex, and then descending deeper and deeper into the mines, reconnecting you with the opening areas via express elevator once you've gotten the key from the depths of the mine. The mine falls apart when you're in it. It'll crush and incinerate a player pretty randomly and constantly, and little besides patience or familiarity with the level can help against it. A step forward in environmental legibility, a step backwards in fairness, perhaps, towards the player. For me, though, it was at least somewhat worth slogging through the first chapter to see a prototype for Quake 2's aesthetic, created before that aesthetic had even been determined. The end of the first chapter is kind of a highlight of the expansion for me that way. It genuinely does seem like a giant industrial fusion of the arcane with military sci-fi. The game even handily gives you the objective for the next chapter: destroy the machine that powers this portal to shut it down for good. So you go into the dimension of dark fantasy for a clearer purpose than "there's a room down there somewhere, I guess." I expected this new narrative direction, however slight, to perhaps clarify or improve my player experience, but to my surprise, it did not. Instead, the dark fantasy levels kind of need obscurity and abstraction to function. They are mazes of mystery. The mystery should not have been disturbed, ultimately. And that's the curse of getting what one asks for. As a player or as a critic, I sometimes think that I know what I want out of a given game or a game design philosophy, sometimes common sense things like Quake should have a story. It's good to be wrong about things. That's where artistic novelty and genuine surprise live. Scourge of Armagon is a negative example, proving the inscrutability of Quake 1's main campaign to have been a strength, after all. That's what makes little discussed content like Scourge of Armagon so compelling to me as a game critic. Without it, I would not have gotten to see that my longing for a more linear story without complementary linear level design was misguided, fundamentally misguided. The second chapter ends in a way that is interestingly similar to how Doom 64 ends, and how the lore of Doom Eternal would pick up from there. By completing Morden's Keep and destroying the device, you find yourself adrift in space and time. Quote, "A wave of nausea suddenly flows over you and you find yourself cast out into a liquid void. You float lifelessly, yet aware, in a lavender sea of energy. After what seems like an eternity, you feel the presence of a diabolical intelligence. You are helpless for a moment, as your mind is open to that of Armagon, Quake's general and master of this realm. Recognizing you as the one who foiled his attempts to conquer the Earth, a hellish howl fills your mind and blots out all consciousness. When you awake, you find yourself on the shores of reality, but in a time and a place unknown to you." End quote. This phrased the expansion to make a third chapter in the style of Peterson's Elderworld, a deliberate hodgepodge of textures and patterns, nonsensical by nature. The aggression and cruelty of these levels scale with the complexity of the mazes. They take longer and longer to complete, more and more quick saves to manage my progression. What they're leading up to, though, is an important missing link in the transition between Quake 1 and 2, the boss fight with Armagon himself. Armagon's fight is a straight combat challenge in a round arena with pillars. More importantly, he's a biomechanical sci-fi kind of monster. Weapons for hands, mechanical feet grafted to a monstrous fleshy torso. This is what Quake 2's Strogg are made in the image of. An interesting aspect of the Shores of Reality approach of blending eras and styles without regard for sense or consistency is that sometimes the mashups are really good. Consider the Chapter 3 secret level. There are tons of secret levels all throughout Quake 1 and 2. I never found most of them, but this one I did. Called Edge of Oblivion, it's just a bunch of interconnected sci-fi platforms in a dark void. Designed for multiplayer so players can use rocket splash damage to knock each other into the nothingness. That's the practical reason why the level exists. But I also like it as fiction. At the end of time, here is some lonely platform crawling with monsters somewhere in space long after the stars have gone out. Pretty neat. And it only takes like 4 minutes, so pretty neat is all it really ever needs to be. Scourge of Armagon isn't the best expansion pack ever made, or even for the Quake franchise. If you're weird enough to play Quake for the story though, this is the first time that story coheres into something tangible enough to follow, the hidden predecessor to Quake 2's Strogos campaign. The second expansion for Quake 1, the Dissolution of Eternity, is the hardest by a large margin. The levels reach an even higher level of complication, going from an average of 5 minutes to complete, upwards towards 15 minutes, and eventually 20 minutes. The expansion completely changes the rhythm of combat to do so. Quake 1 has a very limited set of weapons, with an even more limited set of ammunition. Part of the difficulty curve in Scourge of Armagon is in juggling the increased enemy count with the constrictive ammunition limits. Dissolution of Eternity introduces alternate ammunition for most weapons, basically doubling the player's capacity to store lethal firepower. The new ammunition is rarer, sure, but just being able to switch to it for a little while takes the stress off of the original arsenal. The new ammunition adds new functions to some weapons as well, like turning the lightning gun into a cannon instead. The combat is messier this way, weirder, but the increased difficulty is actually well mitigated by a rocket launcher that fires 4 rockets at once from a separate pool of ammunition. From a mechanical perspective, it's more engaging and more experimental than the previous expansion pack. Narratively, it's actually the biggest mess of the 3 original campaigns, possibly because it tries the hardest. Dissolution of Eternity was developed by Rogue Entertainment, whose previous claim to fame was a title called Strife that actually blended fantasy role-playing with the first-person format. Strife was wildly ahead of its time, and also received a modern remaster for contemporary audiences from Night Dive. Strife actually had plot. It actually had dialogue. It is an antique prototype for many modern titles, but what's funny about it in comparison to the original Quake is that Strife's blend of first-person action with NPCs and dialogue is likely to be more familiar to a given modern player than the dark, moody labyrinths of Quake 1. Game design trends, ultimately, favored Strife over Quake, even if the contest took 2 decades to reach that point. Strife has a lot of sci-fi elements in addition to the fantasy vibes. It's like Quake in that way. In other ways, Strife is more similar to the game that Romero wanted Quake to be than the Quake he actually helped develop. So, was Dissolution of Eternity an opportunity to pivot back towards that design? Might have been. Instead, it just creates a more complicated, top-heavy Quake experience. The story assumes that Quake has messed with the fabric of time itself to render your previous accomplishments void. From the manual, quote, "Let it be known that in this moment our master brought forth from the void of order and light a new existence of glorious darkness. His mighty hands fashioned this world of chaos, violence, and pain. Our past, our present, and our future are molded by the seeds that he has sown. Through his wisdom, he has given us ancient guardians to tend the chain of time. Their suffering is our link and lineage throughout all time and forever. In honored service, we come before him to pay our age-old debt. We whisper this humble prayer with the knowledge that he will hear our thanks for what he has brought to pass." End quote. And this is cool and all, but what about old Shubs? What was Shubs, and what did destroying Shubs matter? Is Quake a god, a land, or what? Somehow, they have created more lore than ever for the franchise, and none of it clarifies a goddamn thing. The linear progression of the first mission pack was so structured, each unit of missions had a clear aesthetic and a clear goal. Dissolution of Eternity only has 2 units, and only one of these units has any kind of thematic organization whatsoever. The first unit, which can even be skipped if you want to, is just kind of a random assortment of very intense dark fantasy mazes, kind of like Sandy Peterson's Elderworld, but less visually confusing than what Peterson did. That sense of consistent personality is kind of absent. Some of the levels have memorable or interesting moments and encounters, but they don't seem to add up to anything that conveys either thematic weight or personal playfulness. In the first unit, it's like playing a record B-side first. There's a lot of chaff, then suddenly you flip the record over and it makes a lot more sense. Unit 2 has you moving backwards through time, through a progression of levels that all move further backwards into strange fantasy. And at the end, you fight a boss so obscure in the id Software canon that Tim Willits himself has forgotten that it ever existed. In that interview he did for the documentary series No Clip, Tim Willits was asked if there were any enemies that never got implemented into Quake. He immediately talks about the dragon. There was an early pre-release screenshot that had a dragon in it before the idea was abandoned, along with a lot of other work that had been done before the game became another one with rocket launchers and stuff. Willits talks about how making the pathfinding and AI work for the dragon was a total nightmare, and they couldn't actually drop the idea fast enough once they started working on it. The dragon is here, though. Look at him go. To be fair, his AI actually is very awkward and easily confused. His level is just the Shub's arena without the other enemies in the puzzle. It is one of the worst boss fights in all of Quake, possibly the entire id catalog, but it does actually exist. Willits not remembering that the dragon was ever even implemented is very interesting to me because it highlights how obscure these expansion packs actually are and how little of an impact they actually made. Being included in the modern remasters is likely bringing them to a much wider audience than ever played them in the first 2 decades of their existence. Forgotten artifacts of the old days of gaming. So much of the abandoned content developed for Quake before it was finalized made it into Dissolution of Eternity, not just the dragon. Like all these antiquity-themed levels, before moving backwards in time, you need to pass 4 elemental challenges, which is kind of interesting to convey with such limited 3D tools. So the air challenge becomes moving through accelerator pipes like some kind of Mario level after the Silent Hill air raid siren rings. The fire levels challenge lies mostly in confronting tiny versions of Chthon. Compromises, then, with what's already possible within the engine, instead of creating expensive new set pieces. Once you pass the elemental trials, your time traveling begins in earnest. First, ancient Greece, identifiable mostly from the pixel tile mosaics and the big pillars. It is still Quake. But after so very, very many levels based on the same templates and textures, it is very exciting to get a new kind of look for the game. It's incongruous, awkward, and strange, but that is exactly the appeal at this stage of Quake. Quake 1's appeal lies so much more in the messy confusion of it than its technical successes. It was a pioneering prototype, but it was such an odd prototype that much of what the game actually is never carried forward into newer titles. Take the next level, Egyptian-themed. It looks completely unique from pretty much every other Quake level, but at its heart, it's still an overcomplicated maze of corridors. It's also one of the longest levels in the entire game, taking almost half an hour. Sometimes one of the darkest and blandest levels too. Hey, how about that Sphinx though? The game pivots oddly to an Aztec theme next. That's the least of the levels, and the one that got me asking, is this a story of some sort, this moving backwards in time, or is it more of just an organizing theme? With the absolute minimal amount of narrative investment, is there a difference between theme and story? For whom does the story exist? Is it for the player to understand the context of their play, or is it for the level designer to create a structure for coming up with ideas for levels? If all the game is boils down to labyrinths and bloodshed, and that's why the player is there, then doesn't the story at that point become just a method of organization and little else? In the early years of gaming, this was often the mindset, that story didn't matter much compared to the vibes and the verbs of the game mechanics. Quake's historical irony is that the transition to 3D game worlds was how narrative became such an important pillar of game design in general. As games evolved from abstracted experiences into more directly representational ones, as the distance between how the real world looks and how these digital world looks continued to shrink, cinematic design came to almost completely replace the labyrinthine style. Quake's technology allowed this transition to happen, and so the game itself feels oddly backwards this way, rejecting the narrative-driven future that games like Strife had already been pushing towards. At the end of Dissolution of Eternity, you fight your dragon at the beginning of time, destroying the machine that was disrupting the regular flow of events. Everything goes back to normal. It was as if it was all a dream, or all a nightmare, a vague journey of mood and sensation through a place that makes no logical sense, that has no permanence upon awakening. Quake 2 agrees with this assessment of Quake 1 as essentially a dream. It takes the entire concept and starts over, taking it from the top, focusing on narrative more than any other id shooter had at that point in time. Quake 2 doesn't just have any old story, it was developed as a very loose sci-fi adaptation of the 1961 World War II movie The Guns of Navarone, which isn't speculation, the developers have explicitly said as much. In Guns of Navarone, a group of commandos assault an isolated island where German anti-air emplacements are making it impossible to launch a rescue for the island's many prisoners of war. The guns need to come down, and the commandos have to put it all on the line and make considerable sacrifice to do it. If there's any consistent criticism of Guns of Navarone as a film, it's that it's formulaic, even for 1961. That formula is exactly why it could be adapted into a 3D video game about fighting biomechanical space monsters almost 40 years later. All the character work in the movie is tossed out. Quake 2 has no characters for the most part besides a handful of names. The setting from the movie gets tossed. The majority of the actual scenes of the movie go by unreferenced in any way. So in what way is Quake 2 adapted from Guns of Navarone? The vibes, man. Just as Quake 1 was primarily a mood piece, designed according to emotional suggestion, Quake 2 works on the same principles. But instead of the disorganized chaos of the first game's production, the mood is channeled and molded to be imitative of an action thriller from the early 1960s. Characters, scenes, and setting are not necessary when all Quake 2 wants to steal from Guns of Navarone is the emotional tone. So the story of Quake is completely rewritten and retconned in the manual, which I remember reading with interest in the passenger seat of my dad's Toyota Camry when I was like 12. This is where childhood me picked up the game, although it was far too confusing in the level design for me to finish until I was in my teens. The manual exposits, quote, "Long shadows claw desperately away from your dusty combat boots, fueled by the relentless sun of a late Texas afternoon. Shading your eyes against the glare, you squint for the thousandth time at the line of soldiers ahead of you. It stretches on endlessly across the rubble, disappearing at last into the cool shadows of a troop carrier. Soon, you'll walk up the ramp into the ship, climb into your one-man cocoon, tear through the interplanetary gateway, and smash down, light years away from the blowing sand and blasted ruins that surround the Dallas Metro crater. Slightly rocking back and forth under the sweltering August sun, you spit out of the side of your mouth, rub your eyes, and think back to the day when the wretched creatures first attacked. Like flaming meteors, their crafts pounded into the earth, and unbelievably, these biomechanical aliens, these hideous cyborgs, swarmed out while their ships still sizzled with re-entry heat. They killed or captured anything that lived. We figured the Strogg were after our planet's resources, minerals, metal, and water, things like that. But their onboard storage facilities did little to disguise what they considered to be resources, fleshy limbs and organs for new cyborgs, and of course, food. You recall your first official day of training, your unit commander discussing how these damn parasites made it to the Earth and other nearby colonies in the first place. By employing our best satellites and long-range scanners, we learned how they travel light years so quickly. The Strogg use these black hole-like gateways as their highway to heaven. We still don't know if they created these rips in the fabric of space and time, or if they simply discovered them by accident. Either way, it's like opening the door to an all-you-can-eat restaurant for these bastards. In about 2 hours, we'll be entering the same interstellar portals to hit them where it hurts, on their own turf." End quote. So from Guns of Navarone, we steal the framing device of world power versus world power, playing for the stakes of global survival, but seen from the perspective of a single Marine within that conflict. From Quake 1, we steal the teleporter technology, the general idea that there was some kind of previous conflict, and now we're doing a sequel that turns it around. Like Guns of Navarone, it's an underdog story where the villains are clear and unrepentant, focusing on bringing down a giant piece of artillery that keeps the conflict necessarily limited in scope until that artillery can be destroyed. To make room for the new Space Marine stuff, all the old Space Marine stuff from Quake 1 had to be completely overwritten. No mention of Quake, that fast-moving bastard, whatsoever. Which is fine, because you left off the last game altering the flow of time at its root. Because the last expansion pack went so nuts with its plot, that plot, astoundingly, does not conflict with a top-to-bottom retcon of every single element of setting and storytelling. Which I think is just so fucking funny. and more, it's illustrative of how weird of a franchise Quake is and how wildly it varies from title to title. Anything goes, broadly speaking, anyway. The funny thing about Quake 2 is that once you get past the novelty of the framing and the confidently complete reworking of the basic concept, this game is the most fundamentally straightforward out of all of the Quakes. One of the most illuminating anecdotes about Quake 2's production, I think, is that as reported by game history website Hardcore Gaming 101, musician Trent Reznor declined to do the soundtrack for the second game like he did for the first because he thought Quake 2 had no atmosphere. Reznor's soundtrack for the first game is a massive element of the original success in building a consistent, immersive mood. Quake 1's music does not sound like what one might expect. It's not loud, it's not fast-moving. In an interview from back in 2000, Reznor himself explains it like this for Insight magazine. Quote, "With the music of Quake, there was this approach. It's dark, depressing, dingy, kill everything, tense. Okay, what films have that same sense of dread? The decision on my part was not to make it amped up, so I kept everything subtle, so you wouldn't get sick of it the second time you play the game, but I would set up elements of tension. And because it was off the CD, it could be as many instruments as I wanted. It could be an orchestra, it could be one thing. That was a huge relief. Though they were always siding on the side of gameplay over, say, having the shotgun sound in stereo. But then they should be. The game is about playing the game. I remember when the game came out, I saw it at the Virgin Megastore, and on the box it said, New Nine Inch Nails music, but I always thought that was an inappropriate way to look at it. For what it was, it's good, but it's not meant to be listened to on its own. What I was hoping to achieve with it was not so much some adrenaline-pumping, let's go kick-ass Rob Zombie kind of music, but more like the music in films by John Carpenter, the tension and uneasiness, or David Lynch, the dissonance or sound as atmosphere enhancement." End quote. Quake 2, in contrast, uses exactly that kind of music which creates an adrenaline-pumping, Rob Zombie-esque let's-go-kick-ass atmosphere. One-man German rock sensation Sonic Mayhem did the soundtrack for Quake 2 instead of Trent Reznor. Sonic Mayhem even helped out on the soundtracks for the expansion packs, which is cool because the Quake 1 expansions did not carry over Reznor's sound or sound style at all, and came out kind of generic. Sonic Mayhem's work on Quake 2, and also on Quake 3, isn't generic at all. It's perfectly paired with the player experience, a creative precursor to the way Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal used heavy metal soundscapes to support and channel the frenzy of gameplay. Quake 2's soundtrack is equally good as Quake 1's, as is the gameplay, but differently competent. Quake 2 experiments only so much as it contributes to the core gameplay loop. Quake 1's successes were as accidental as they were intentional. Quake 2's successes are all coordinated and planned, refinements on the messy first draft that the original Quake laid down. I really disagree with the idea that Quake 2 has no atmosphere. The atmosphere is just ultimately more familiar to modern players, the tense and dreary oppression of wartime violence that modern visual media has been iterating on since the Guns of Navarone and long before. Quake 1 was exciting for Reznor because it was novel, it was experimental. He got to make strange music to accompany strange art. Little about Quake 2 is actually strange. But like the new Sonic Mayhem soundtrack, what it lacks in novelty, it makes up for in verve and intensity. It's wild how much closer Quake 2 feels to modern rhythms of play than Doom 1 and 2 or Wolfenstein 3D did by a huge margin. And maybe this was the idea in remastering instead of remaking the early Quakes. On release, Quake 2 was a transitional title. Its linear campaign was a step forward, but not enough of one to feel like a shift in the whole FPS subgenre. Quake 2 came out on November 11th, 1997. On November 19th, 1998, a game using a heavily modified Quake 2 engine came out, called Half-Life. The ways in which Half-Life revolutionized the presentation and pacing of first-person shooters are almost too many to count. Half-Life created so many of the moments and motifs that still define cinematic, naturalistic presentation in hundreds of titles. Half-Life's primary pacing device is arranging its interconnected levels in an unbroken chain, creating a sense of linear progression and a cumulative journey. Quake 2 was designed with something similar but not quite as naturalistic. Quake 2 divides itself instead into units of levels, which are arranged in a linear order, but it breaks them up with short videos showing you moving between the unit areas. It's kind of like how Doom 1's levels were shown on a little world map as you moved between them. It seems like such a small difference for Quake 2 to have these transitions and for Half-Life not to, but Half-Life's deeper creative choice is that it never uses pre-rendered cutscenes at all for anything. It begins in-engine, with the player in first-person control, and remains that way throughout the entire climax and even the brief epilogue conversation with the mysterious G-Man. By allowing you to play the game, immersive soundscapes and level design also encourage a player to forget that they are playing. It creates an experience that always exists within the player's present tense. Quake 2's more deliberate structure, the factory unit, palace unit, the prison unit, and all the cutscenes tying them together, remind a player they are playing a video game, and should probably treat it as such. Players are given a tally of secrets found and enemies killed for a level of a unit on completion of that unit. It reaches towards a kind of narrative immersion with the way the units fit together and paint a cumulative portrait of the Strogg and their homeworld of Strogos. Quake 2's individual pieces are made with visible seams, however, where Half-Life's are invisible beyond the minimalist loading text. At these visible seams and unit transitions, you are treated as the player and graded as a player, not a player character. Quake 2's narrative elements are too slight and its gestures towards immersion too antiquated to feel like a modern campaign the way its gameplay still actually feels in meaningful conversation with modern FPS conventions. So if you remade it, all shiny and new, something would feel off about it. It would feel just as stuck between eras as it was on release. By remastering it, instead, these points of friction also become points of historical interest. Keeping the original aesthetic preserves the original creative intentions. It preserves that sense of playing some kind of forward-thinking but odd or awkward prototype. Like going to a car museum and seeing the old steam-driven buggies whose engines would have to come up to temperature before even being used. The fascination is not in comparing with the modern day, but in appreciating how it was done then. The imagination and technical creativity involved in creating an industry that had never existed in the world before. Quake 1's chaotic development is reflected in a lack of cohesion in the campaign. Quake 2, on the other hand, represents a much more deliberate and businesslike refinement of all the production methods that had been learned on Quake 1. It was not the era that came before, where 3D was new and completely undefined, and it was not the era that came after, where 3D game space was interpreted as a stage onto which more conventional cinematic and theatrical narrative could be projected. Quake 2 has always been somewhere in between, stuck in a period of industry transition that leaves it a bit of a creative orphan. A remake would have no power to resolve that transition and would hurt its own presentation in the process. A remaster, though, a good remaster like this, celebrates that period of transition and illuminates it, placing the art in the context where its imaginative leaps can actually be appreciated. The opening cinematic sets a perfect mood for what's to come. The human warships, green and menacing, pulling into orbit around an angry red planet, your personal pod released as part of the grand invasion, just like it said it would in the manual. So the manual story isn't just stapled on, much of it is exactly as visually portrayed here in the opening cutscene, creating a greater sense of immediate narrative than Quake 1 had. Then your pod crashes, and off you go, blaster in hand. In terms of 3D level design, this is exactly the opening as well. Here is your smoking, broken pod behind you, and the whole of Strogos ahead of you. Quake 1, like Half-Life, allowed player interactivity from the very beginning, even for things like difficulty selection and world selection, but by integrating these abstract menu choices into the interactivity, Quake 1 never created a feeling of natural immersion like Half-Life did. Creating these narrative bookends with cutscenes and player statistics allowed Quake 2 to attempt to portray a more linear cinematic journey for the player without sacrificing the self-awareness as a shooter that was part of the personality of id Games. That self-awareness is even a major part of the studio's personality today, with the ironic meta-mythology of Doom Eternal. That's what sets those games apart these days, though. Game design as a whole followed Half-Life's example so much more than it did Quake 1 or Quake 2. Quake itself, as a franchise, is as convoluted as it is because it contorted so strangely trying to chase some of those trends with Quake 3 and Quake 4 and Quake Champions. Quake 2 is an anchor of sorts for the franchise. It makes the most sense and plays the best out of all of them, at least from my perspective, as someone who prefers campaigns to multiplayer. From this crash site on the edge of the capital city, you need to fight your way closer and closer to the core, taking down the Navarone-influenced artillery piece, disabling the city's defenses, and eventually storming the palace to take down the ancient emperor of the whole Strogg Empire. Narratively, the Strogg are actually very fascinating because they're kind of a speculative endpoint of what any society that exists solely for the sake of conflict will look like. Industrial abuse and endless wars left Strogos what it is now, a desolate wasteland of heavy industry, populated only by slaves. The Strogg use cybernetics to take all the useful pieces of their enemies and reanimate them for the war machine's purposes. It's an infinite suffering from which death is no escape, the flesh and the machine, in a foul symbiosis where neither half lets the other half wither or die. Because the Strogg can only conquer and process, not grow or create, they use the Slipgate technology to take the fight to other worlds. But they done did mess with Texas, didn't they? And after the crushing defeat they suffered in Dallas, it's time for humanity to reverse the tables and take the invasion to the Strogg directly. As a hive mind, taking out the Macron, their general, should end the war. Considering how much time I spent trying to figure out what was even going on in Quake 1, this narrative clarity of Quake 2 is very refreshing. The plot, minimal as it is, works very well as a horror concept. It's using sci-fi to present an enemy that's both visually disturbing and thematically disturbing, even thematically satirical in some ways. In terms of immersion and how the game fuses horror elements with environmental storytelling, the research labs and prisons are the most fascinating levels of Quake 2. All throughout the game are these moments where giant machines are being used to mutilate and pulp human prisoners of war, turned into slurry, biomass, fuel for the war machine. While Quake 2 has given up almost entirely on fantasy tropes or imagery in favor of sci-fi, these massive industrial torture devices are visceral and sadistic in a very obviously Spanish Inquisition kind of way. These torture rooms tie Quake 1 to Quake 2 aesthetically, in addition to creating some of the strongest imagery in the game. They toe the line between cartoonish absurdism and genuine, horror-driven despair, sad, and also silly, and also preposterously gory for the time. This has been part of the tone of id shooters ever since the original Doom, a huge part of the vibe in Quake 1. Just because Quake 2 is very brown in places doesn't mean that it isn't part of that tradition of creative sadism or doesn't have that same kind of tone. It's just a little more hidden beneath the more surface elements of earth-tone military sci-fi. Quake 2's focus on military sci-fi is ultimately what defines the pacing of the game, though, more than any aesthetic flourish. Quake 1's levels were so individual from each other, with minor exceptions like the elemental trials and the expansion, so that the succession of one maze after another became, eventually, exhausting. Each unit of Quake 2 is so tightly oriented around its end goal instead that this fatigue never sets in. In a unit of levels, all 3 levels will tie into each other. There will be parts of a level that you return to and pass through differently. Backtracking heavily would be annoying, but the level design rarely requires this. It loops back around on itself in ways that always feel so clever and surprising. This is all driven by complications in the military goals. You can't blow up the thingamajig while the who's-a-whatsits is still active. You've got to go down into the service oubliette and readjust the widget valve so the power cube can power up. All these little complications bounce a player from one map to another, and they also build anticipation so that achieving the unit goal feels like something that actually has a little drama and a little heft to it. These goals get more interesting the deeper into the game a player gets. By the time you get to the factory unit, every unit goal is about destroying key pieces of Strogg war infrastructure. The power plant unit is a particularly interesting example of the contrast between Quake 2 and Half-Life because both games have this set piece where you have to navigate a gigantic power plant. In the climax of Half-Life, you're powering up the portal to Zen, the alternate dimension, and everything is done up in these bright whites and oranges. It looks like a big machine. Quake 2 has you shutting down a gigantic reactor plant instead, but it chooses not to mix up the aesthetic in any major way. It's still mostly rusty corridors and rusty machinery. Half-Life even ultimately requires more platforming from a player than Quake 2 does. Yet despite the platforming, Half-Life feels less artificial than Quake 2 because of its more careful visual design and its more deliberately immersive setting. Quake 2 reaches its peak of design, I feel, towards the end. The Palace of the Macron is such a cool departure from what had come before, a little pomp, a little decoration. It's interesting to me because of its suggestion that the Strogg have some sense of culture, but that it's faded and vestigial, like an echo of something they can no longer remember. The way Quake 2 ramps up its difficulty over time is very kind compared to Quake 1, and because of this, the last levels are the only parts of the game that are very difficult, the way Quake 1 so often was in Worlds 2 through 4. Giving the tank enemies an even more powerful Royal Guard version of the climax is a great idea too. From the encounter design to the level's aesthetics, everything feels appropriately climactic. It genuinely feels like treading on forbidden ground, hunting for the hidden hand behind the Strogg. And finding him is even better. The Macron, instead of leaning into the horror of biomechanical fusion, is almost totally devoid of visible flesh. The Macron looks, in some ways, a little underwhelming. Those little robot guys that look like Wall-E with legs and a terrible disease, those are made in the Macron's image. I love this design because of how it emphasizes the Strogg's indifference to pain and suffering, that all humans are nothing but spare parts. If the Macron is primarily a robot or too far removed from the flesh to remember, then pain is, in fact, an alien concept to it, and it has no reason to feel any sympathy at all. It is an insurmountable gap in perspective, which is what often feels alien in science fiction villains. Your final fight with the Macron takes place on a secret base in the asteroid field around the planet. He flees the palace as you fight your way through and retreats through a portal to this final arena, which sets up itself such a memorable little ending. Post-battle, the station begins to deteriorate. You can go looking for secrets or just escape as the gravity goes sour. For the final cutscene, you hurtle back towards the planet's surface just like you had at the beginning, but this time you pop the door off the pod and your character's hand sticks out to give a quivering, triumphant. It is so simple, so self-consciously fun. Quake 2 is a game that refuses to overcomplicate itself, and in doing so, it is equally more coherent and satisfying than its predecessor. The first expansion pack for Quake 2, The Reckoning, was released by Xatrix Entertainment. This is notable for the kind of expansion that it turned out to be. The Reckoning takes the basic frame of the lone marine with a difficult mission and tries to add even more cinematic set-piece touches. It's very playful, if less consistent than the main campaign. The expansion's main interest is in creating a sense of long journey and constant escalation of environment. The manual story mostly just retells a marine pod landing gone wrong until the last few lines, which I enjoy very much. Not because it's good, but because it's cheesy and awful in the most ideal possible way. It reads, quote, "Something's out there. Mud-coating and aching, you dropped into a crouch behind a mossy boulder and search for a weapon. Even a rock would be something. Hot damn! Better than you could have hoped for. It's your shotgun, loaded and ready to rock and roll. Splash, splash, splash. You rack a shell in the chamber and jump up, aches and pains forgotten. Too many damn fine Marines didn't make ground fall today. The Strogg are gonna pay. You swear that soon, real soon, there'll be a reckoning." End quote. Hot damn, a shotgun, loaded to rock and roll. That's all a growing boy needs, really. It's this kind of pulp from which the modern Doom series is built, the basis of all the storytelling in Doom Eternal. So you can see why Quake fits in awkwardly with the modern id catalog. It's already been scavenged in so many ways and reinvented in so many others, all of which conflict with each other. Even if the fundamental impulse of all of these games boils concisely down to hot damn a shotgun. The new levels begin on the outskirts in bland canyon lands fighting weird beasts. This portion is the one that feels the cheapest. It's an understandable impulse to want to explore the outdoor setting a little more, but the visual effects are just bland and murky. All of this is a prelude anyway. The real meat of the mission pack is in the labyrinthine Strogg military installations ahead. The Reckoning has a tremendous understanding of everything that made Quake 2's levels feel cohesive, the surprise recursions and the colored lighting, the blood and the boxes. What it adds is a more sensical progression and a more grounded set of goals. A fascinating mid-expansion moment comes as you're reintroduced to the outdoor door canyon lands. You need to find an aerial strike beacon, but it's been stolen by the weird singing poison lizard men, so you need to track them back to their lair. When the airstrike comes through, it's a special effects bonanza that opens up a new path forward through the level. What's interesting about this is that Xatrix's journey to fame as a wargame studio sort of began here. Previously, they had published Siberia 1 and 2, an odd but lovable adventure game on-rail shooter hybrid, and also two goofball shooters called Redneck Rampage. The Reckoning was a chance to do something a little more grounded, as strange as that sounds. Xatrix became Grey Matter Games, which developed the ahead-of-its-time expansion to the original Call of Duty, United Offensive. United Offensive was a considerable improvement over the main campaign in terms of cinematic immersion and level cohesion, just like they did for Quake 2. Later on, Grey Matter was absorbed into Treyarch and has worked on Call of Duty ever since. But the studio's very first attempt at a military first-person shooter started all the way back here with The Reckoning. Here's how ambitious the level design is. On the unit transition map, the climax looks to be Unit 4, the spaceport, but it isn't. The spaceport is a huge, sprawling thing where your objective ultimately comes down to stowing away inside of a crate to be loaded onto a freighter. Then you spend a very difficult level shooting your way up to the bridge of the freighter with a boss fight of sorts against the bridge crew. Once hijacked, you land the freighter on the moon and infiltrate the moon base, which looks suitably more high-tech and fancy than any of the regular level textures. Once other games began to explore the possibilities of a 3D game space, not just Half-Life, but also titles like the original Jedi Knight, these sorts of visually dramatic, narratively grounded level progressions became the norm. Even within the campaigns of Quake 2's original release, there was so much room for improvement. Xatrix improved on these ideas immediately, seizing on that faint phantom thread of the Guns of Navarone influence and iterating on ideas that would have the studio, later, be something of an authority on World War II game design. It's a step towards that more modern era, similar to how Scourge of Armagon refined the linear aspects of Quake 1 and paved the way towards a more familiar future. The last original expansion for Quake 2, Ground Zero, is a much larger step backwards for the franchise and its gameplay than The Reckoning was a step forward. Developed by Rogue Entertainment, just like Strife and Dissolution of Eternity for Quake 1, I figured Ground Zero was gonna be great. Instead, it's possibly the most niche out of all of the early Quake campaigns. Dissolution of Eternity was experimental, unpredictable. Ground Zero is just overcomplicated and dense. Out of all the Quake 2 content, this expansion most closely resembles the disconnected, labyrinthine design of Quake 1. The Reckoning was focused on unit objectives, but in a way that felt in keeping with the main campaign of Quake 2. They were balanced objectives that helped the different levels cohere into a composite whole when the unit was done. Ground Zero's objectives are so complicated and constantly shifting that this cohesion is lost. Why do one thing when this can be split into 4 subsections? The levels, for the most part, are not meaningfully different from others in visual design. It's just the same boxes and rust as always. These boxes and rust just take so much longer than usual to get through. Quake 2 had mostly solved the issue of bizarre, overly obscure level progression that made Quake 1 so frequently frustrating. What seems to have happened is that Rogue tried to top themselves in a way that's out of step with Quake 2's actual strengths. It's an expansion that is much more complex than Dissolution of Eternity, and this just makes it slow as molasses in most places. The number one greatest convenience that the remastered version adds is a quest compass that actually works very well. I used it sporadically throughout the main campaign, mostly to understand the level transfer in the power plant unit. I used the compass more in The Reckoning, and in Ground Zero, I used that compass about once every 90 seconds to figure out where the fuck I was supposed to go. There's not a huge amount of interviews or documents around from those days, but a Rogue developer named Jim Molinets once wrote a level design process guide called Level Design Strategies and Pitfalls. There's a section called the Level of Detail Rule. It goes, quote, "The level of detail rule is something that is quite different for each designer, but basically this rule is a guideline for the designer to follow in case major changes are needed. Level of detail is basically designing the room or area in layers of detail that can be removed or changed as needed. If you can afford a giant fireplace with a great scrollwork mantle over it and the cathedral ceilings, then hey, that's perfect. However, if the room becomes too costly, then the designer must choose the layer of detail to change. Is the fireplace absolutely necessary? Can the ceiling be lowered to decrease size? What if the fireplace became a bookshelf instead? These are some of the options available, but all designers should remember that, in the end, nothing is sacred. As the constraints become more of an issue, the designer will be forced to delve deeper into the detail layer in order to accommodate changes. If the changes needed are drastic enough, the designer may be forced all the way back to the basic structure and layout of the area and forced to start fresh again." End quote. That's the contrast between the two expansion packs. The Reckoning sacrifices complexity of Labyrinth for visual spectacle, where Ground Zero has barely any visual spectacle at all to allow for maps dense enough to have 3 or 4 goals apiece. Even at the end, why just use a bomb when you could be asked to assemble that bomb from a casing and core that are kept in entirely different levels and areas of those levels? I have been resisting calling out Quake 2 for being an endless repetition of the same boring corridors, but that is genuinely what Ground Zero feels like. Hallways and boxes and locked doors, without purpose, without end. It's hard now to picture this being the dominant form of the game, but for a while, corridor shooters were a ubiquitous feature of the game market. They were like how open worlds with RPG progression and crafting became the standard today. It was an oversaturated format. Now, the tight linear FPS is much more rare. The new Wolfensteins, besides Youngblood, are notable for how they buck against the modern trends and return to the source format. But the new Wolfensteins are also highly cinematic, narratively driven. To focus only on the labyrinth is a narrow design philosophy, the narrowness of which is well demonstrated by Ground Zero. Alone, a maze cannot often stay exciting all on its own. It becomes rote, predictable even when a given solution is unknown. The only way to keep it truly fresh is through the only thing that can't be programmed: human interaction. At the bottom of the Strogg Castle in the main campaign is a secret museum of sorts. It contains within it the disembodied head of John Carmack, which then becomes an item that you can use. At the end of Doom 2, fellow developers hid John Romero's head behind the main boss in the place where you're meant to do damage. Romero's inclusion in Doom 2 is famous. Carmack's hidden head in Quake 2 is not. His head isn't even really the most important display in the hidden museum anyway. Instead, it's this out-of-place poster of Carmack in front of his first Ferrari. In 1997, in celebration of Quake 2's release, Carmack gave that exact Ferrari away as a prize for the Red Annihilation Deathmatch Tournament at the Electronic Entertainment Exposition. It was won by Dennis Fong, now recognized as one of the world's first professional esports players. Red Annihilation itself was one of the earliest major esports events. Before Fong won his match, Carmack addressed the crowd, saying, quote, "I bought my first Ferrari after the success of Wolfenstein 3D. Doom and Quake have bought me 3 more. 4 Ferraris is too many for me. Rather than sell off one of them or stick it in a warehouse, I'm gonna give it back to the gamers that brought it to me in the first place. The King of Quake Deathmatch is gonna get a really cool crown." End quote. And Fong did. He kept the car for 10 years. Fong even wrote the official strategy guide for Quake 2. Although Quake 2 has an actual narrative, a story to follow, the next iteration of Quake only makes sense with this story in mind, the story of how Quake and Doom didn't just establish what the first-person shooter is for an entire generation, they also built the entire concept of competitive esports from scratch. The very first major deathmatch tournament was put together by Microsoft for the launch party of Windows 95. Dennis Fong was there. In an interview with David Kushner, not from the book, but for Kushner's website in 2013, Fong recalls, quote, "I remember I was on stage. This was actually in the semifinals against an opponent who I thought was going to win the event. He was a very cocky individual. His name was Murloc. When I defeated him, I remember he slammed the keyboard and kicked the chair off the stage, basically. It had all the emotion that you would expect to see in a real sporting event, which is obviously what we see now with esports. It was the first time I really played in front of that many people, spectators on a stage. People were cheering. The opponent was raging and losing. It had all the feelings, like there was definitely something there. I would say that definitely that was a very seminal moment for me that said, hey, I think this has all the emotions and intensity and stress and entertainment of a real sport. I thought it really had a chance." End quote. And you know what? It really did. Quake 3 is a game built from that world, for that world, at the absolute exclusion of everything else. The story is much simpler than Quake 1 or 2, barely more than a basic hook. Eons ago, the Eternal Arena was built. Champions from across the universe are abducted to participate in its blood sport. You are one of these esteemed warriors. Quake 3 released in December of 1999. Half-Life's release the previous year had been the massive catalyst for change that Quake 2 had not been. Narrative was the new norm. Quake 3 completely defied that trend. It decided that the core of what Quake meant to people was not the strange, fractured fantasy worlds of Quake 1 or the military sci-fi of Quake 2. The core of Quake was deathmatch. So what Quake 3's campaign does is introduce the maps one by one with bots of varying levels of challenge. At their highest level, these bots are meant to simulate actual human reaction speeds, but on the lower difficulties, this is toned down quite a bit. On the easier levels, the bots are just sheep to be sheared. On the medium levels, they're obviously artificial but provide some challenge. On the higher levels, they are shockingly aggressive. I didn't really bother to play above medium, for one somewhat insurmountable reason. I hate the way they move. I genuinely do. The way they simulate human movement in deathmatch is by being in a constant jittery motion, bouncing here and there, zigzagging always, jumping at random intervals. This is accurate to deathmatch, but also a reason I never really did get into multiplayer games very much. I have difficulty following and predicting these kinds of movements. Enemy AI in Quake 1 and 2 was never like this. Monster movement never is. The movement of enemies in a single-player setting is a way of characterizing these enemies. Encounter design relies on them behaving in consistent, predictable ways, with multiple enemy types in balance throughout a given encounter to create different flavors of challenge. Deathmatch is pure, twitchy reactivity. Deathmatch, to me, feels like a single flavor of challenge, and I don't even care for the taste. The levels of Quake 3 are divided into tiers, which have their own mostly distinct rosters of enemies to fight, but they never feel distinct. There are dozens of different enemies, or player types. The protagonists of Doom, Quake 1, and Quake 2 are all here, along with many variations on the aesthetics and themes, plus a lot of other characters with a dated, amusing edgelord vibe like zombie bikers and bikini vixens and an eyeball with legs. It's a menagerie of cast-off ideas and idea fragments, kind of like Quake 1 in a way. Nothing coheres, nothing fits well together, but not in nearly as interesting a way as Quake 1 failed to cohere. There aren't even weird complications like how the lore exposition in Quake 1 contradicts itself so constantly. There is no lore for Quake 3. Just fight! First to 10, first to 15, first to 20, on and on up the tiers. Who you fight doesn't really matter, only that you fight a little faster. With real humans behind these character models, that's a little different. At that point, the massive menagerie of opponents is a means of player self-expression. Who you choose becomes a statement of sorts. Silly, sexy, grotesque, masculine. While the modern hero shooter is distinct because all the hero characters play differently, and all Quake 3 characters play the same, there is still some small hint of what's to come. For all these new subgenres to flourish, game modes beyond deathmatch would have to gain popularity. Modes its direct competitor had already implemented in many ways, right after Quake 3 was released. Quake 3 and Unreal Tournament were in development at the exact same time, unaware of their rival's existence until they were released. Unreal Tournament came out 1 month earlier, on November 30th, 1999. It was, itself, a multiplayer-only sequel to a previously single-player-oriented game, but Unreal Tournament contained so much more than just deathmatch. Capture the flag, objectives-driven assault mode. There was so much more thought given to the possibilities of play in a 3D environment than what Quake 3 represents. Quake 3 is primarily a refinement of the community that had grown up with Quake since the first one, oriented around deathmatch exclusively, for the most part. In 1996, a mod for Quake 1 called Team Fortress was developed. It wouldn't really take off until it was remade for Half-Life as Team Fortress Classic. After that, it would get a major retail version called Team Fortress 2, cementing a path where the hero shooter as a concept would finally become a major popular pillar of the esports community. It all goes back to Quake. But id, as a developer, did not embrace the full spectrum of possibility presented by its creation. Quake 3 has faster, meaner, more refined deathmatch gameplay than Unreal Tournament. It just doesn't have much of anything else. A highly specialized product for a highly specialized gaming community. id crunched in the following year to add the kind of game modes that Unreal Tournament had at launch, resulting in the much-maligned Team Arena expansion. It's not that Team Arena is terrible, it's just that it only does this very basic task of adding capture the flag and such, and nothing else, with some new weapons or old weapons like the classic nail gun, which seems unnecessary because the plasma gun was basically Nail Gun 3.0 anyway. There is no single-player mode at all for Team Arena, not even a tiered one. No expansion of the world or the lore, just a last-ditch attempt to close distance with a competitor whose vision was wider. Nothing about Quake 3, the way it is, appeals to me very much at all. Where Quake 2 was criticized for having no atmosphere, I tried to dig underneath to find what was redeeming. Here, with Quake 3, there is simply nothing underneath. The technical advances no longer shine, the art feels washed out and flat. Quake 3 feels like it's missing half of itself without a single-player campaign that's more than bot matches. Quake 3 so confidently threw out the whole concept of a narrative because it thought that the future was deathmatch. But the next generation of id games pivoted entirely. In the mid-2000s, for both Doom and Quake, the future was narrative. The id Tech 4 engine was one of the most dramatic leaps forward in gaming technology that I've seen in my lifetime, as startling in its own way as the id Tech 2 Quake engine was in 1996. As dramatic as the technology was, it only ever wound up in a handful of games. Doom 3 rebooted Doom as a slower-paced, atmospheric horror FPS. Wolfenstein was rebooted in 2009 as an inconsistent though ambitious shooter with a semi-open world. An alien abduction shooter called Prey shared strong horror themes in common with Doom 3, plus a few smaller id Tech 4 titles. And then, Quake 4. Quake 4 ignores both Quake 1 and Quake 3 entirely to create a full-throated sequel of the second game's war against the Strogg. It picks up right where the last one left off, with the defeat of the Macron, allowing humans to jump in more ships and resupply the war effort. You're part of that second wave. Rather than pre-rendered cutscenes, everything is done in-engine, showing off the engine's muscle. In hindsight, the dramatic focus of Quake 4 highlights the fact that, as amazing as the engine was with texture and shadow, it never did get faces right. There's a particularly plastic look to the faces in this generation of id games that I do find kind of charming. Gaming used to be full of strange contradictions like that, games with good textures and bad faces versus games with good faces and flat textures. It wasn't so homogeneous as it is today. But the cinematic naturalism of today's games was the inevitable convergence point of all these many early attempts at making 3D spaces come alive. Quake 4, like Doom 3, plays much slower than its predecessors and is much more concerned with atmosphere. The difference between them is largely format. In Quake 2 and in Doom 3, you were always alone. The game sometimes teased you that you were meeting up with other squads, but they would always die in front of you or you arrive just too late. It happened so often in Quake 2 and its expansions as to basically be a running gag. In Quake 4, you have companion characters in many of the levels. It works better without them, so the game sends you out alone for the majority of your time, but there's never an hour that goes by where you don't interact with NPCs within the actual environment of the level. Atmospheric horror is what the engine does best. Giving up that atmospheric horror, I think, is why Quake 4 is thought of as the least of these initial releases. Replacing that horror with what seems at first like a very straightforward military sci-fi plot just doesn't have the personality of Doom 3's supernaturally decaying Mars base, or Prey's interest in making you feel lost in a giant alien biomass. Quake 4 does not really deserve its reputation as the bland one, as much as it initially seems at least. The thing that throws people is that Quake 4 gets off to a very slow creative start. The game spends a great deal of time establishing what normal conflict against the Strogg looks like so that it can then escalate and complicate the story. Once the twist kicks in, the game settles into a really fantastic and creative rhythm. It's just not obvious because at first, the game's interest is in re-establishing the setting, assuming, perhaps correctly, that in the nearly 8 years since Quake 2, there would be few who remembered the old fight against the Macron. Quake 4 was developed primarily by Raven Software, who first began working with id way back in the 90s with their Hexen and Heretic dark fantasy shooters, games that had a lot in common with Quake 1 tonally. Raven, however, followed a different path later on as a developer. After working with id on Wolfenstein 2009, Raven began working as a support developer for the Call of Duty franchise. So it's not just Xatrix Grey Matter who made a Quake campaign influenced by World War II moods and imagery, and then went on to just make war shooters permanently. It happened to Raven as well. There's a whole secret Quake to Call of Duty pipeline that I never would have known about if I hadn't started trying to figure out how the hell such a complicated odd series got that way in the first place. It serves also, I think, to illustrate how Quake 4 begins in a way that feels overfamiliar to a lot of people. It had been a long 8 years since Quake 2 asked, what if Guns of Navarone, except Navarone is a badass space fortress? The cliché of the soldier being separated from their squad, having to fight through a hard landing, this had already been used in everything from Half-Life Opposing Force to Call of Duty itself. Introducing the squad one by one with the protagonist as the rookie who has to prove themselves, this is as by template as it gets. The first level plays it absolutely by the book, and it was a book that anyone who was into shooters at the time, or now, would have read many times over. But then Quake 4 does something very interesting for a shooter like it at the time. It introduces a non-combat hub level. Your ship drops from orbit, providing a mobile barracks, command center, and staging area. A player can rush straight to briefing or, for the first time in franchise history, pick up detailed information about the setting's mood and technology by listening in on ambient conversations. It's nothing groundbreaking, but it is grounding. It creates a sense of human stakes and casual believability. It's not self-consciously a game the way Quake 2 was with its kill counts and secret counters, its division of named levels into discrete units. Quake 4 has definite chapters to it, but the narrative experience runs on cinema logic and not arcade logic. Quake 4 cares about immersion. That's why it wants a slow start. Because by the time you see this ship again, the context for who your character is and how they're treated will change completely. For that future story beat to land, a baseline of normality has to be established. It even uses the pretense of a wartime newscast to recap the events of Quake 2. Simple as they are, the newscast adequately condenses the entire game into about 30 seconds. There is a craft and a care to the world building in Quake 4 that's obvious even so many years later, even if it is ultimately mostly conveyed over a 20-minute interlude. Doom 3 also introduced a lot of narrative beats and world building compared to previous titles in the series, but Doom 3 does it in a way that is borderline ironic, melding the satanic and the demonic with a banal corporate sterility. Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal both borrowed from Doom 3 that way. Quake 4 is different. It is straightforward and sincere. So there is no irony, no layer of metatextual commentary. Even Prey was comparatively playful with its tone and influences. Quake 4's only interest is in taking Quake 2 and making it more fundamentally cinematic, a focus that's unambitious in retrospect, but surprisingly compelling if you are one of the few bizarre weirdos like me who played Quake 2 for the story. The first third of the game hews to that familiar, standardized war shooter format. Even within that limited format, though, are some really memorable, excellent sequences, like the modestly named Perimeter Defense Station. This is a level with a completely self-contained arc of progression. It begins quiet, a momentary foothold for tactical coordination and medical aid on the way to grander Strogg facilities, and it stays quiet for a significant amount of time, letting the player get quite deep into the facility. Then, the counterattack. Your position overrun, the situation deteriorates in mere moments. There's a lot of excellent scripted deaths and scripted ambushes that are every bit as clever and gory as the ones in Doom 3. You loop back around to the entrance, and by the time you do, you're the last one there. It feels like an older Quake level because of this recursive design, while also demonstrating what an impressive modern presentation it had for the time of its release. All in one compact 20-minute sequence. The Tetranode, your destination for this chapter, is even more impressive. It's got some genuinely excellent moments of visual sci-fi. The structure itself has a great deal of personality, all blue-lit and cold. This is what id Tech 4 did best, this kind of intricate and dense industrial look. The big reveal isn't much of a much. Oh no, a new Macron! Maybe he'll be a coconut one this time. It's the bait and switch that's significant. You can't win this boss fight. You fail, are captured, and when you wake up, you are one of those poor Marines who were tortured and processed into goo back in Quake 2's medical dungeons. The Stroggification scene of Quake 4 is, I think, an all-time great moment in horror gaming. It uses the first-person perspective and the on-rails design of the sequence to create a feeling of tangible hopelessness and helplessness. You're visibly wounded in ways that are quite obviously close to fatal. It doesn't take much to imagine the pain being endured here, and the sound design backs that up with aggressive machinery noises and saw whirring. Where a movie like Hostel uses gore and torture of others to provoke nausea and discomfort, Quake 4 makes it more personal and more intense with this first-person perspective by leveraging the time you've already spent identifying as Matthew Kane and learning his short backstory. Quake 4 unfortunately kind of peaks at this moment. It is so visceral and so compelling, and while the back two-thirds of the game are better than the front third, the game just never surprises as art like this again. When your squad breaks you out just before the mind control is activated, the Call of Duty vibe continues, just altered a little. Like how you can read the Strogg language now, all the signage swims around into a much more legible font when you look at it now. And you can use Strogg healing stations. Plus you get a durability boost from being as much metal as flesh. It shakes it up. But consider the boss fight with your squad's CO, Voss. Voss gets Stroggified also, but in a way identical as a plot beat and almost identical as a monster to a fight from both Doom 3 and Prey. Doom 3 faces you off versus Commander Kelly, one of the only friendly voices in the game until he gets all demony and stuff. Prey has a boss fight against Jen, your character's girlfriend, and the driver of much of your progression through the giant living spaceship. Prey came out a year later, true, but next to each other, it is odd that all three games feature such close variations on that particular moment. Quake 4's version is indeed the least of them. which holds true for, admittedly, a lot of things, big and small, across its whole production. What I mainly wish is that Quake 4 had gone harder than it did with the ideas that it had, like the planet of Strogos and the Strog environments. In Quake 2, the color was this deep and angry red. Doom 3's Mars had already claimed red as the dominant landscape color for this game generation though, so Quake 4 pivoted backwards to beige. The Strog are meant to be this ultra-industrialized civilization who have utterly ruined their planet, and that comes through only some of the time, not nearly to the extent that it could have. In my mind, the setting was one of the strongest elements of Quake 2, one of the essential pillars of its personality as a game. Here, the game actually suffers for its use of id Tech 4. It's an incredible engine as far as architectural detail and light is concerned, but about the only thing it does worse than faces is landscapes. Just like Quake 2, the most beautiful vistas of Quake 4 are all accomplished through skyboxes, and not the actual level itself. The worst parts of Quake 4 are the traversal levels, where you have to spend time out and about in these rendered outdoor areas. The areas are never anything more than fishbowls and corridors of varying sizes and shapes, and the vehicle combat is simple, irritating, and completely unnecessary as an inclusion. Half-Life 2 had come out the winter before Quake 4 was released in 2004. Perhaps these levels are some sort of stapled-on response to Half-Life 2, to the sense of scale that overland sections in Half-Life 2 create. It's not like the original campaign of Half-Life 2 had a huge amount of landscape detail either, but Valve did it so much more artfully, just like they had in 1998. Quake 4's outdoors feels so lifeless and so slight that they detract from the overall presentation, no matter how cool piloting a mech sounds on paper. I feel like this could have been an opportunity to do some very cool visual world building, to genuinely surpass Quake 2 by showing off a kind of player's journey that the earlier game could not. Quake 4 wants the sense of scale that Quake 2 tried to create in its between-unit cinematics, it just executes very awkwardly on the idea. The middle part of the game is the worst offender, where the pacing sags like crazy as you attempt to reach a faraway extraction point. But even this most mediocre part of the game has high points. Quake 4 is neither good nor bad for long, it's always weaving from one to another. Within a slog of forgettable environments is the Waste Processing Center, where you must kill a grotesque monster who processes the waste within the vastness of its gut. It is a memorable creature design. The level design becomes memorable for how you navigate around the big fella, in moodily lit waste pits and drains filled with body parts, blood, and viscera. Old forgotten barrels contain failed marine to Strog conversions, zombies, effectively. This switches up the flavor, pacing, and tone of the mechanical encounters while leveraging the lighting system to create very dark and anxious moods. It's not a long sequence, but it is a sequence that breaks up the rhythm effectively at the exact moment it begins to feel pretty stale. After this long, irritating middle is your return to the command ship. A not at all triumphant return. People take one look at you and your new body and despise what you have become. The fact that you lived makes it worse for them. Why you? Why not all the friends and loved ones who were turned into monsters and paced without even the chance to resist? It's a tremendous story beat for what Quake 4 actually is. Short, unfortunately, but incredibly compelling. It's the twist that Quake 4 needed, to take that classic war story vibe and add some of the classic downbeat features of older war stories, that skepticism of how war changes a person, the resentment that builds against those who survive by those who have experienced the full weight of loss. Upper Command, however, is more than happy to use you as the tool you are. In the last third of the game, you take it from the top to execute one massive, sprawling mission. You will destroy the Macron and the entire Strog communications network in one coordinated strike. Insertion begins in a Quake 2-style drop pod flying through the air before crashing into a tall tower to begin the assault. What makes all this so good is the pacing. The objectives are accomplished quickly, with purpose, and putting them all at the top of these towers creates a true sense of scale where you look from one to the other and see what you've already done. A boss begins chasing you around the time that you're climbing the second tower, culminating in a big fight at the top of the third tower. Things move so quickly, the encounter design is so aggressive, the sense of progress and accomplishment so tangible. This is just excellent FPS campaign design, period. It comes at the end, though, a consistency that simply isn't present in the first 66% of the actual game experience. A lot of people made up their minds about Quake 4 long before the game seems to have made up its mind about itself. Doom 3 rocks it from level 1, by contrast. It's more focused on both the technology and the pacing of the campaign, clearer with the mood, snappier with the scares. Quake 4 struggles to compare favorably to its peers within the limited pool of id Tech games. The best of Quake 4 is in how it adapts and remakes Quake 2, which is a much more limited, particular definition of success. In the last third, Quake 4 nails every one of those particulars. The biomechanical horror is pervasive and wonderfully gross. The vibe is very World War II, despite or perhaps because of the sci-fi filter. The combat is peak aggression with a mix of many types of enemies at once, with a full arsenal to murder them with, including the good old nail gun and other staples from the Quake franchise. Nostalgic adaptations and remakes are such a common part of the modern gaming landscape, so it's especially interesting to consider Quake 4 as one of the early examples of a game franchise going through that process of rebirth. It isn't even a full decade between the release of Quake 1 in 1996 and Quake 4 in 2005. Within the space of that decade, 3D gaming as we know it today was invented, refined, made into a sport, and then the 3D tech gets pushed so far forward that the fourth game looks like it came from a totally different game development timeline. The industry never moved so fast as the turn of the millennium. The differences between games in 1996 and games in 2005 is a broader gulf than the difference between games from 2005 and 2023. Quake is there for every major step of transition, not as the best games or the most classic games. Quake is, instead, the connective tissue that holds the fabric of this period of game development together. Quake is gristle and muscle, chewy and strange. As game development moved past this era of rapid change and settled into a more stable corporate era, this has made Quake increasingly difficult to reboot or remake the way they did it all the way back in 2005, which makes this game's last lines particularly ironic. You've had your victory over Macron 2.0, the day is yours. They could have just left it there, but no. The big brass rolls in, congratulates you, and growls not to get too comfortable because there's another mission waiting. Which there was. It would just be another 11 years before it came out. And it came out for Quake 1. For Quake's 20th anniversary in 2016, a brand new official map pack was released made entirely by one person. Jerk Gustafsson, actual name, serious job, is one of the founding members of MachineGames, the developers behind the new Wolfenstein reboots. Between releasing the New Order and the New Colossus, Gustafsson made time to celebrate Quake's 20th anniversary by releasing Dimension of the Past, a set of Quake levels with the express intention to revisit that very chaotic, primordial era of level design and game feel. This is so fascinating to me because of what the new Wolfensteins themselves represent. The most narrative-centric, word-heavy, emotionally intelligent adaptation of an early id title to date. The new Wolfensteins are, creatively, so much more confident and clever of a franchise reboot than Quake 4 was in its era. And yet, Gustafsson had this creative impulse to move completely backwards from that modern conception of an FPS campaign to make this level set that has no plot, no dialogue, no narrative whatsoever, except for the sense of personal authorship that Quake 1's various worlds provided. Gustafsson made, 20 years after the fact, World 5 for Quake 1. What's remarkable about it, and why I imagine it was made an official 20th anniversary release, is that Gustafsson completely nailed it. There are some differences in the player experience, like how it's a lot stingier with health and ammunition than the original campaigns. Dimension of the Past feels balanced around Quake experts, and not the general interest balance the original campaign had on normal difficulty. My feeling is that this is fine, since for the most part, it is only Quake experts who get this deep into the franchise anyway. I'm just here because I'm stubborn, and the quick save feature is basically a superpower. It is well worth it to try and persist, however, because what Gustafsson has mastered is the pattern of level design that defines Quake 1 so specifically. Every level is a variation on the recursive maze design, where there are no wrong directions, not really, and the true path snakes in and out of every part of the level, connecting them in surprising and clever ways. In one level, the gold and silver keys are placed above the opposite colored doors, at the very beginning of the level, teasing you. Getting them is a considerably more complicated affair, and then there's a whole wing of the level after those keys are found. Dimension of the Past is not just an imitation of the kind of level design that gave Quake 1 its unique, peculiar personality, it is a fine accomplishment of its own within that template. I might always feel like VORs are cheap as hell in any given encounter personally, But that is part of Quake 1's spirit of sadism. It's just mean as hell to the player in clever, darkly comedic ways. Has been ever since Romero touched it. Take this excellent key trap. Damn thing killed me like 10 times before I figured out where the buttons to turn it off are. Dimension of the Past beautifully illustrates what I've been trying to talk about regarding level design as its own kind of art, its own particular way of communicating emotion and mood to the player. Dimension of the Past feels just as personal and individualistic a work as Willett's, Romero, McGee, and Peterson's levels felt in the original campaign, while also feeling in keeping with the rhythms and expectations established by those older artists. Dimension of the Past deserves its place as World 5. At minimum, this 20th anniversary release is a far better tribute to the series than some kind of convoluted, corporatized live service sequel would be. Quake Champions, released in 2017 as an early access title and not officially finished until 2022, is exactly that convoluted cash factory of a title. At its core, it is Quake 3 with really nice graphics, and it didn't have to be more than that. Yet, it is everything on top of that. Quake Champions is a game drowning in live service progression systems that encourage constant engagement with petty rewards and prizes. Quake 3 lets you be a weird little eyeball guy right off the bat. Quake Champions makes you grind for it. It hopes you'll pay for a random loot crate to drop the little eyeball guy as an epic prize. This is annoying, but not fundamentally devastating to the game. More than other live service titles, Quake Champions is perfectly playable without spending a dime on it. It's free to play without engaging in the freemium aspects at all. And the part that is free is, Quake 3, but with modern aesthetics. There had been other Quake multiplayer spin-offs like 2007's Enemy Territory Quake Wars, but that game was completely shut down. Quake Live was Quake 3, but in your web browser, no installation needed. Since 2010, Quake 3 Arena has been essentially free for anyone via this Quake Live version. Quake Champions is different because, with its live service progression systems, it is demonstrably a different game from a different era, not just Quake for Quake's sake. It reminds me a little of the Team Arena expansion that way. It's a bolt-on addition to Quake that tries to add in what's hot now, in this case, hero shooter elements and loot boxes. What's very funny is that as part of the many unlockables, one of those unlockable categories is lore. Like for the Ranger, protagonist of Quake 1, default starting dude of Quake Champions. Ranger's lore is done up like diary entries. Our boy writes, quote, "The place was a maze. It was like the worst dream I've ever had, but I know how to follow orders. I just had to find Quake and kill it. No time to think about what the hell I was seeing. Why was the facility laid out like a death trap? What about those psycho Marines, the poor bastards? Who did that to them? Doesn't make any sense. I was fighting for my life as soon as I got there, and then things kept getting darker and weirder. There were other slip gates, and I went through them, nowhere else to go. No idea where they were leading to. I just shot anything that moved, and I've been shooting ever since." End quote. Here we are, 27 years after the fact, still trying to grapple within the franchise with just how little of a shit the first game gave about any kind of narrative sense at all. This lore says Quake is old shubs, but that's just conveniently leaving out all the other nonsense the expansions dumped on top of it, and much of what Quake 1 actually had to say for itself in the first place. Mostly, Quake Champions just wants a long explanation for why Ranger has his particular hero power. This retcon is hidden in the margins of Quake Champions because litigating what the first game was actually about is basically impossible. And I love that. Since I don't really even enjoy Quake 3 in its standard open form, I definitely didn't care for it wrapped up in a fancy Skinner box of live service elements. What I wanted was more Quake 2 or more Quake 4. Strog shit. Single-player campaigns. And for a long time, the only thing that even might have scratched that itch within the official releases was the version of Quake 2 they put out for the Nintendo 64. Night Dive's remasters include the N64 version of both Quake 1 and Quake 2, but only Quake 2's version is notable. Like Doom 64, it actually is a whole new set of levels produced by Midway Games. What's interesting to me is how, when Midway did Doom 64, it leaned into that game's darker elements a little more. It made the monsters a little nastier. Quake 2 64 leans the opposite direction, making things much brighter and more cartoonish. It is still dark and industrial in parts, but the N64 version has almost none of what landed the tone or setting of the original game. Sometimes to the point that it feels more like Commander Keen but mean than it feels like Quake 2. Yet that's kind of what makes it charming. Instead of the cutscenes showing a player moving from place to place with a moody green wireframe, the N64 version uses a placemat art map to show how all the levels are connected and your journey between them. Within those levels, there are some things it does that are more ambitious than the original Quake 2 campaign, like how it pulls from the Reckoning and has you steal a spaceship to move from one facility to another. If, as Chris Franklin suggested, the early Quakes are primarily mood pieces, then looking at an alternative version of the game where the mood is completely incorrect for the setting illuminates quite a bit. The N64 campaign is still fun, the gameplay rhythm still hit. It is still Quake in the playing of it, which gives the whole campaign an uncanny feeling where its fundamental emphasis on bloodthirsty, heavy-impact violence feels unsupported by the arcade sci-fi environments. If the tone of the violence was lighter, the levels would fit better. They're not bad levels at all. More than just stealing a spaceship, the campaign takes the better parts of the expansions and incorporates them well. Some of the objectives and scripted moments are similar to moments from the original campaign, like aligning these communication dishes, but the look of them is so busy and so bright in comparison to the original presentation, it feels like its own thing. Some things are more Quakey, like this mid-game boss fight that adheres to the boss appearance template laid down by Quake 2 and its expansions. Pretty much anything to do with the combat itself feels like it always has, meaty and mean. Some things just don't land the same way at all, though, like the Strogg torture room levels. Sure, there's this instance of lowering a cage of poor guys into lava, but the environment isn't nearly as brutally industrial as it was in the original campaign. It is easy to criticize the inescapable brown earth tones of the original Quake 2 campaign, but in witnessing the exact opposite approach within an actual official campaign, it becomes clear how well the muted palette of the original helped sell the mood of the setting. Quake 2 64 also does nothing to solve the essential conundrum of the franchise that's led to such fractured, divergent titles. What makes Quake Quake? Because the gameplay, even in the N64 version, or the remastered version of it at least, is more reactive and more actively enjoyable than the gunplay in Quake 4. The gunplay in Quake 4 is fine, adequate. It's just not as fast, not as rhythmic. It doesn't have quite the right flow that even Quake 2 64 has. What made Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal so remarkable is their return to that flow. But that leaves Quake out in the cold as just some multiplayer hero shooter, safely on a side stage so as not to pull focus. Consider Dimension of the Past. The best modern follow-up to Quake at this point had not been a reboot or a remake or a modernization, it was just more Quake. More of what made the original game special and unique. More of the art style that defined them in their era of their release, free from modern gloss and RTX-enabled beard stubble. id and Bethesda seem to have arrived at this exact conclusion, because when Night Dive Studios released their remasters of the games in 2021 and 2023, they released them with brand new campaigns for each title by the full MachineGames studio, actual sequels to the foundational Quakes in every aspect. Night Dive Studios took Quake 1 and 2 and transferred them from the old id tech that drove them to their flexible, modular Kex engine. Kex allows developers who are still making levels for older titles to use a massive array of modern lighting tricks, and to build levels that are considerably larger than anything originally possible. The MachineGames campaigns, Dimension of the Machine for Quake 1 and Call of the Machine for Quake 2, make full use of all of these contemporary creative possibilities. They each take the base experience and aesthetic of the original games and intensify those things to their most extreme limits. The new campaigns never become completely detached from the old rhythms of play, though. They carefully tease out and intensify elements of the old campaigns instead. It has been surprisingly difficult to find information about the development of these two new Quake games. There's a series of interviews on Bethesda's website called Nods to Mods, one of which features MachineGames developer Christian Groert. He said that it began as kind of an in-office side project coming out of the office Quake Club. Quote, "We also have our weekly Quake Club at MachineGames where we try to keep ourselves entertained by showing off things that we make. It started up as just a way for us level designers to flex our design muscles outside of work, but we ended up creating a fantastic release with Dimension of the Machine. I'm super proud of us managing to pull that off when a lot of our team members had never even played Quake before." End quote. And yeah, kudos to the Quake Club indeed. Dimension of the Machine has levels that are just as difficult as Dimension of the Past, but the whole thing is much more visually impressive and well-paced. For one, it uses modified Quake 2 style structure with 5 units of 2 gigantic levels. Each unit is a different sort of world with a different sort of vibe, and like the worlds of Quake 1's original campaign, they can all be played in any order until all are beaten and the boss unlocks. The levels are so massive that each unit takes around 40 to 60 minutes. It is likely that it will take a given player longer to complete the new campaign than the original 1996 campaign. It is absolutely, genuinely, a full-ass sequel to the original, and I cannot believe it hasn't made much of an impact that way. This is Quake 5, and then Quake 6 for Call of the Machine. It's absolutely wild how much creative effort and developmental sweat went into the creation of Dimension of the Machine. So why is it buried within the remaster instead of getting some sort of independent, full release? One reason, I think, is that it mostly makes sense in dialogue with the original. It would be very confusing to modern expectations if it was labeled Quake 5. This would suggest the same treatment that Doom and Wolfenstein got. No matter how much of a legitimate sequel Dimension of the Machine ends up being, it isn't a forward movement for the franchise, it's a backwards expedition into its roots from a modern lens. A successful expedition, but too far astray from what people think of when they think sequel to be marketed that way. Sequel is the word, though. A nostalgic work would seek to recreate. Dimension of the Machine surpasses the original at every turn, using Quake 1's own established language of combat and environment. Nostalgia isn't supposed to wear white to the wedding that way. This deliberate and dramatic upstaging of the original is what a sequel does. To do this while also being faithful in large part to the original is a hell of a needle to thread. The deftness with which Dimension of the Machine manages it might make it the best of Quake 1, a quarter century's worth of refinement in one remarkable package. The frame is that you're rune hunting again. 5 realms await, each with its own mood and theme and rune. Before talking about the best of them, I want to talk about the most clever and visually impressive. The Realm of the Cultists is actually one of the shorter units, starting as the most beautiful and ending as the most sinister. Almost immediately at the beginning, you approach a vast cathedral in the middle of a green canyon land. Blue skies, white marble, totally unlike anything from the original campaign or Quake 2 at all. And yet the doors have blood pentagrams and monsters infest its halls. This leads to a fun fight where, upon winning, the floor drops out and you fall into a deep pit. It's an almost From Software kind of touch. Yet the broader sequence feels so perfectly in keeping with the Quake vibe. It leverages those weird knights and toxic ghost thingies into something that actually feels artistically cohesive. The cathedral basement has some weird tech that culminates in a portal. This portal inverts the whole cathedral. You're turned backwards, upwards, on the ceiling, and when you reach the main chapel again, the whole place is now some kind of hell dimension. It's the coin flip inverse of the previous level in every way. It looks tremendous. There's such a visual drama to it, and the tightness of the player progression through the 2-level set makes it a joy to be in. The hellish version feels surreal enough to actually give off appropriately dire and sadistic vibes. It feels evil. It's evocative, emotional, and cryptic, just like all the best of Quake 1. Not all of them value the visuals of the world so highly as this realm. Like, as a good counterexample, the Realm of the Machinists. It's a pretty relentless industrial maze where mean combat encounters and classic labyrinthine progression is king. It seems like the one that's meant to be played first. It hews the closest to the classic rhythms of the original Quake 1 campaign. It does its best to toss in some modern touches, though. The original Quake rarely ever bothered to create large combat arenas, and when it did so, it was mostly to do a 2-tiered kind of thing, where there were a lot of enemies above you instead of just hanging out in a murder pit with you. Which made sense because that kind of 3D was such a novelty at the time. Being able to aim above so cleanly was something worth showing off. The modern Dooms are all about the big brawl in breathable arenas. Dimension of the Machine leans into that a little, Call of the Machine leans into it a lot. Dimension of the Machine modernizes this way mostly where it feels right for the rhythm, climactic moments like this final big combat challenge in the Realm of the Machinists. The environment feels like the original Quake, even if all the spinning gears in the background mark it as being a bit more of a modern production. An arena fight feels right for the moment. All the traditionally designed encounters build up to it very well. Dimension of the Past wanted to do something in keeping with the original campaign. Dimension of the Machine, even in its more classic-feeling levels, wants to improve on it with modern technique. Consider then the realm of the astrologers. It's more ambitious with the way it incorporates fantasy and sci-fi into a heady, chaotic blend than anything in the original campaign. It begins in some kind of astral plane with floating platforms made of rock. It's like Half-Life Zen, but a little more mystical. This leads to a big fantasy temple, mysterious and ancient. So far, so engaging. Then the level drops a twist. The temple is trapped and you get transported to a cell in a sci-fi prison. A sudden, complete tone shift like 5 minutes into the level. Fighting through the sci-fi base, you reach a slip gate, which takes you to another sci-fi facility, but in a fantasy world with collapsed castles, a dig site. The base itself is weirdly detailed and even naturalistic in some ways, with an actual barracks that's collapsing into a lava field, a cafeteria, and a motor pool. It is so much less abstract than any of the facility levels in the original campaign. It uses instead the kind of environmental naturalism that Half-Life pioneered. Then, the level twists again, even more spectacularly. The deeper down the dig site you go, the more it pivots back to fantasy, then dark fantasy. There's a hellish, shattered temple down there in the depths that looks more actively demonic than anything the original Quake or the original Dooms managed to accomplish with their own engines in their own time. It's metal as fuck, yet it keeps going down to a series of platforms that hang suspended over a blank void. The bottom of the world. Which makes no physical sense, but that's the point of fantasy. It just has to feel right, and magic covers the rest. So within just 1 of 5 units in this new campaign, the developers demonstrate complete tonal mastery over the conflicting elements of sci-fi and fantasy that the original completely failed to resolve. Here they are in actual harmony, a sci-fi civilization using their slipgates to explore a magical universe filled with dark secrets man was not meant to know, hidden horrors never meant to be unearthed. The realm of the astrologers, using only level design, creates a more coherent narrative than anything in the first game, and a more creative narrative than anything in the second game. The realm of the astrologers isn't even the best, most impressive unit, which is astounding to me. While spending 40 to 60 minutes on 2 levels is a long time by Quake standards, the density of the levels and their truly remarkable scale means that you're actually experiencing cool new things at a much faster rate than some games ever manage at all. The realm of the blacksmiths is one of the best levels of anything that I've ever played. Distinguishing between the 2 levels is pointless. They are completely interconnected and function as a whole. The art design for this realm is, I feel, the absolute peak of what Quake can be, a beautiful example of what could have been if the original team had, 25 extra years to figure out what the game was supposed to be about. There's just a ton of implicit lore in the level too. This dimension, or planet, or whatever this is, collapsed a long time ago. Now the scavengers have come. These ancient cathedrals and castles have been taken over and burst open by a parasitic industrial infrastructure. First level is just breaking open the castle factory thing. It's a complicated, involved process, but the scale of the castle is never compromised or forgotten. As deep into the tunnels and corridors as you get, the level always takes the time to orient you and show you that you haven't even gotten close to breaching the walls of the thing. When you go down into it, the whole depths of the castle are bathed in red. It's not just the brown industrial of Quake 2 and a lot of Quake 1, it is Gothic industrial. Trent Reznor would be proud. In a lesser map, this basement would be the whole of it. Instead, the level climbs out of the basement, back into the interior courtyards and towers of the castle, where the unit's rune is trapped inside some kind of sinister machine. All this massive sci-fi infrastructure that you've been snaking around for an hour all leads back here to the source of magic that it was designed to drain. As if all this Space Marine stuff was part of a vast military empire that spanned dimensions, singularly devoted to expansion and power, like the Strogg once were. And say, isn't that the symbol of the Strogg on the banner in the main unit selection room? Isn't that their symbol on all these computer screens and crates? The Strogg symbol was featured on crates even in the original 1996 campaign, but the reason for that was simply that no one had yet come up with the Strogg, and its adoption that way was the result of a massive rebranding of all enemies and weapons in Quake 2. Dimension of the Machine takes a developmental oversight and makes it an actual narrative beat. It connects Quake 1 with Quake 2 in a fascinating way. And in a universe of infinite dimensions and possibilities, why not? Especially if fucking around with timelines and alternate dimensions was already such a strong component of the setting. Dimension of the Machine is such a fascinating object in terms of game design because it uses all of its modern tricks and techniques to enhance the nostalgia and backwards-looking elements. It does not feel like a truly modern shooter, it feels like a modern Quake. It feels like the kind of thing one might have expected to get out of the actual Quake 2 back in the 90s instead of the big rebrand to the Strogg. To position itself as a middle transition between Quake 1 and Quake 2 allows both games to flow together in a way they never did before. Where Quake Champions just kind of shrugged, simplified the lore, and admitted it made no sense, Dimension of the Machine has grappled with its nonsense in a way that is as elegant as it is cryptic. I think it is such a shame that something so energizing to the franchise as a whole got labeled as little more than a bonus campaign, tucked away on the back shelves of a remaster where no one bothers to look. Call of the Machine is a better sequel to Quake 2 than Quake 4 was. I like Quake 4. I like it a lot. But Quake 4 didn't try to understand or improve on Quake 2 in as comprehensive a way as Call of the Machine did. Quake 4 was a soft reboot more than it was a true sequel. It was in line with current trends in its era of gaming and aimed that direction. It wanted to be cinematic and glossy, which it succeeded in, especially for a game from 2005. Call of the Machine, instead, does the same thing as Dimension of the Machine by creating a huge array of themed operations that all pull on some design thread of the original campaign, creating more impressive, more extreme versions of the old rhythms and environments. This time, it's 6 units with 3 or 4 levels apiece. Like Dimension of the Machine, this campaign is actually longer and much more involved than the original in the 90s. There were units of Quake 2 that a player could blitz through in like 15-20 minutes back in 1997, and that just isn't the case here at all. The levels are incredibly dense, many of them requiring the light inter-level backtracking that was such a prominent part of the original campaign. There is a great deal of respect for the traditional pacing and structure of classic Quake 2 levels. Without dialogue, the personality that was conveyed by the game in the first place was done through the twin pillars of level design and encounter design. These rhythms of combat, rhythms of navigation, were what made Quake 2 feel different from Quake 1, or Doom, or anything that came after. Quake 2 was such a unique, idiosyncratic game that upsetting its particular balance too much runs the risk of destroying that sense of personality. It's a delicate thing, which makes it all the more impressive that Call of the Machine completely disrupts the encounter design to modernize it much more than any of the visuals. It's closest, in terms of player experience, to the new Dooms, Doom Eternal particularly, with the way it uses massive clusters of enemies with particular standout threats that require specific player responses and prioritizations. Quake 2, originally, was not horde-oriented. There are actively hundreds more enemies per level here than there were in the original campaign. Not even Ground Zero touches the total number of kills that a player racks up across the course of Call of the Machine. This rhythm is entirely new. How then can the cumulative experience feel so in keeping with Quake 2? Because they can completely change the encounter design without even laying a finger on the player's arsenal. Quake 2's weapons were wildly inaccurate, and in the original campaign this was kind of a bid to get the player to behave more aggressively, to close the distance and engage face-to-face instead of plinking away from a distance. Plus, a lot of the original weapons take advantage of explosive splash damage in some way, or take the railgun, which has always had the property of being able to slam through multiple enemies along its trajectory. Originally, this extra damage would just be spillage. The initial release only asked the player to juggle like a maximum of 24 enemies in a given room, which is part of why it has a reputation of being a little easy compared to other id campaigns. For Call of the Machine, these giant hordes of enemies reach such absurd proportions that they don't actually change the threat level of the encounter. These enemies never live long enough to even hit you for the most part. Instead, all this leftover spillage damage catches enemies to the right and to the left of your crosshairs and takes down everything. Your abilities and your toolkit are faithfully preserved from the original Quake 2. There is nothing new, nothing non-traditional about the way you play as a player. If the new content had just added a lot of new enemies, the difficulty would have actually spiked, like it did in Ground Zero, when it had a serious increase in battle density. By adding an absolutely absurd amount of obviously too many enemies instead, that difficulty spike is actually lost in the chaos of it, absorbed by the fact that every bullet that does not strike an intentional target takes down an unintentional one instead. The enemy hordes actually die faster than a similar horde might in Doom Eternal, being less mobile and less intelligent enemies. As a result, even if this kind of encounter design is extremely contemporary for the most part, the entire feel of the game is actually still grounded in the chunky player feedback of 1997. This is what makes it such an intimate sequel. It takes not only a full understanding of what made the original game unique to pull off, it takes a treacherous imaginative leap to intuit that it could be bent this far without breaking. The result is something truly special. Call of the Machine also modernizes its approach to boss fights, which actually does create a significant difference with the original. It adds a big health bar at the top of the screen and gives the boss a unique name, which isn't a modern thing particularly, but back in the 90s it was never part of the id-house style for shooters. By withholding that feedback, the original fights of Quake 2 felt a little more desperate. You just kept piling on the damage and hoped the thing would die, eventually. The boss fights were also very uncommon. In Call of the Machine, there are multiple boss fights per unit, sometimes once a level and a couple of them like Darkest Depths. Like with the regular enemies, the new campaign cranks up its intensity by making these encounters much more dense and heavy. While I do like the old style of withholding feedback for the purpose of tension, the new style has more flair and personality. The names for the bosses are often very playful and give an impression of how they fit into the setting. They become another tool for the non-verbal storytelling the level design is trying to accomplish. It's also another acknowledgement that, especially compared to Quake 1, the player's weapons in Quake 2 are absurdly powerful compared to the enemies. Since the release version in 1997, Quake 2 has allowed players to store their power-ups like quad damage and invulnerability instead of having to burn them when you pick them up like in Quake 1. Saving them for the boss battles was always the most satisfying move for that. By creating more frequent boss fights, there's more incentive to use those power-ups instead of saving them, creating a further incentive to engage with secret hunting within the level to find more. It's a more pleasing inventory loop, especially better than the approach the expansions took, where they were often really miserly with the power-ups and with ammunition to try to even out the difficulty and keep things tough. Call of the Machine's generosity with power-ups doesn't mitigate the difficulty so much as it just smooths out the flow of the massively dense combat encounters. One fun thing the campaign does is blend arena boss fights with plain old horde ambush encounters, creating these absurdist massacres where you're just burning through ridiculous amounts of ammunition and creatures. It's never one note, though. There's a genuine diversity of approaches to the boss fights. This one, at the end of the Wasteland unit, ditches the horde to pit you against a very difficult mix of about a dozen medium and heavy enemies. There's a tank commander with a health bar, but he isn't special in any way. This particular fight is just a very traditional but very difficult grouping of Quake 2 enemies. It wouldn't have been out of place in the original campaign, during the Palace unit anyway, where the intensity is at a nice peak. Without using a banked power-up, it would be possible to win this fight, but exceptionally brutal. With the player's damage quadrupled, this tough grouping just melts away into a mess of metal and meat. A lot of the success of the modern Dooms is that they're not about challenge exactly, they're about player empowerment. They're about ripping and tearing and being absolutely brutal, more brutal even than the hordes of demons opposing you. This feeling can be created in a very similar, extremely satisfying way within the already existing game systems of Quake 2. It just takes a bit of a new approach to tease that out. Call of the Machine also does a better job than Quake 4 of exploring the broader lore of the franchise and tying it together. Quake 4 tidied things up. Call of the Machine keeps it cryptic and messy, just like Dimension the Machine did. Cryptic and messy is the only way that any of it can fit together at all. Call of the Machine does one better than just being that way, though, by exploring parts of the setting that only ever existed in the margins before, like how the Quake 2 manual story starts in the ruins of Dallas. One of the units of Call of the Machine, Ruined Earth, explicitly pivots away from Strogos to go back to the collapsing brick tunnels of post-invasion Earth. I'll admit that I kind of wanted a ruined cityscape, so the fact that it is mostly a bunch of tunnels is kind of a letdown. What's cool about the unit, though, is that it's a slow burn payoff for the original campaign, finally illustrating something from the actual paper manual, and also it's a fantastic parallel to Dimension of the Machine. Here, a Strog ship drills directly down into the Earth, stripping out precious metals. Consider, though, what they said in Realm of the Astrologers about the enemy arriving on black ships, or Realm of the Blacksmiths and all that parasitic technology they had. It's a very clever integration of both MachineGames campaigns through reference and allusion. Plus, having Earth in the mix as well as Strogos makes it feel like an actual war of some sort. There's even a moon mission where you can see our good old blue marble at the window. Call of the Machine is constantly playful with the possibilities afforded by multiple dimensions and slipgates. It focuses on the interdimensional aspect much more than the original campaign did, where the original Quake 2 tries to mostly tuck the slipgates under the rug where they won't cause too much havoc with a pivot from chaotic genre mashup to focused military sci-fi. Call of the Machine brings back a little of the chaos, a little of the magic that was missing from Quake. One of the units has you infiltrating a factory of some kind that's hollowing out a gigantic dead god or something called Megacorps 4. The exterior is a larger, more impressive industrial structure than anything even Quake 4 ever tried to do. Visually speaking, even though Quake 4's engine is obviously more advanced, Call of the Machine uses the Kex engine and its unshackled possibilities to create visuals that are consistently more impressive than what Quake 4 had to offer. The art is simply better. Oddly, it's one area where I think Dimension of the Machine is actually better. The surrealism of Quake 1 that Dimension of the Machine intensified to such remarkable effect just isn't quite part of the Quake 2 aesthetic. Quake 2's more industrial, representational vibe carries over into Call of the Machine. It's part of what makes it feel so faithful to the original Quake 2 campaign. When Call of the Machine tries to do a maximized version of classic Strogg installations, like here in the Firewall unit, it is amazing. It's better than anything the expansions were able to accomplish, and it even borrows some weapons, enemies, and textures from the expansions to make the new campaign feel like a truly comprehensive Quake 2 experience. The way these units have a player start with just a pistol and a shotgun each time give each unit a better pacing than the expansions, who used linear progression and so were much slower to allow a player access to the full arsenal, and then much quicker to become stale once a player did get everything. There is a self-contained arc of player empowerment within each unit of Call of the Machine, 6 times in a row. One notable episode makes the wild choice to give you a BFG to start with and barely anything else. There is so much experimentation going on, there's so much fun within the level design itself. It's brand new art made with a palette from 1997. Call of the Machine is so conscious of how the fact that Quake has never had much of a plot or much consistency is actually a kind of artistic freedom if you're willing to look at it that way. It can be reshaped and newly molded into so many strange configurations and still remain faithful to the original campaign. Dimension of the Machine might have looked more interesting overall, but Call of the Machine improves on its source material in a far more comprehensive way. The last parts of Call of the Machine are the ones meant to tie Quake 1 to Quake 2 in an even more explicit way than they had been before. It was the part that I was the most excited about, and it was the only part that I felt kind of let down by. The problem is that Call of the Machine has dual climaxes, one of which is much better than the other. The Darkest Depths unit is the most unusual, visually distinct out of all of the units. It uses an aesthetic that isn't found anywhere else in either Quake 1 or 2, mediating them. It's an echo of the dig site level in Realm of the Astrologers, like Ruined Earth is an echo of Realm of the Blacksmiths. Here, the Strogg have been excavating some sort of ancient temple. The design is classic labyrinth, extremely dense, winding deeper and deeper and deeper. It is so much better than the mine sequence in Ground Zero, I can't even express it. Where the expansions to Quake 2 tried to add complexity, it often felt like complication for complication's sake. The complexity in the Darkest Depth unit is intriguing, immersive. It feels like an element of actual exploration and not just puzzle-solving a maze. The Deep Temple is especially fantastic. It has completely departed from the science fiction Quake 2 was so invested in. Murals depict good old shoves and 2 shambler worshippers. This is a temple to the ancient, betentacled Witch Queen, which is quite a way to finish off a story influenced more by World War II movies than by cosmic horror. At the bottom of the temple, you awaken an ancient evil. A shambler appears, just for a moment, released back into the world, no longer bound by either spells or genre conventions. Once you advance into the temple's dramatic final chambers, you find yourself in the middle of a one-for-one recreation of the boss fight from the end of Quake 1 World 1. Modir, not Cthon, but otherwise identical. Mechanically and thematically, we have looped back to the very beginning. Once you've beaten him, you jump down the exit hole, but then there's a twist. Driven mad by what you've witnessed, you die, lost to the dark magics that Space Marines were never meant to know. This is the one Marine of the 6 that doesn't make it back with a data CD needed to unlock the boss. The boss unlocks anyway, though. The thing is, why? This looping action with the Temple to Shubs at the bottom of the world was all that was needed to tie Quake 1 to Quake 2, a cryptic reference, a mashup of worlds and gameplay. The whole frame of Call of the Machine, however, is that all these data disks are meant to determine the location of the creature that made the Strogg in the first place. It's a big promise. And I was sure I knew the answer. Armagon, right? Armagon is literally the prototype and precedent for the Strogg within the franchise as it already exists. I was certain. But no. The last mission is visually striking. It does feel like an otherworldly interdimensional temple, but it's empty. The boss fights are just double bosses of types you've fought many times already. The big reveal of the Strogg maker itself is 2 shamblers. 2 shamblers? Yes, indeed. What's meant by this? How does it work? Why wasn't Darkest Depths just the final unit unlocked by the other 5? Especially because its climax reveal is so much better paced and more intriguing. The Marines even share the same fate in both climaxes, just like the Marines from Doom 64 and the original Quake expansions, lost to the cosmic void forever following their victory. It says that killing the 2 shamblers severs the Strogg connection to their maker, so is the idea that these are the 2 shamblers in that mural who are Shub's chosen or whatever? If so, why did we not also get to fight Shubs again? Or fuck it, how about the awkward time dragon from Dissolution of Eternity? It lacks drama the way they did it here at the end of Call of the Machine, which is so weird considering how both Dimension and Call of the Machine were so skilled in creating drama throughout all of their levels, except this one. Oh well. Almost getting everything I want from a surprise Quake sequel is a lot more than I ever expected to get in 2023 anyway. It's hardly enough to diminish the tremendous accomplishment the new campaign represents broadly. Even if the climax was a little more awkward than it might have been, Call of the Machine and Dimension the Machine do a more impressive job of binding the games together than anything else in the Quake franchise. There is a clear series of steps now, narrative steps, from the moody chaos of Quake 1 to the polished brutality of Quake 2. It's fitting that, in a game series that started off playing with alternate timelines and alternate dimensions, that the best version of these games came out a quarter century after their release. It's taken that long to understand their influence and appreciate their unique peculiarities. The story of Quake is an especially strange and convoluted one, whether fiction or nonfiction. Like its best levels, it wraps right back in on itself. It is one of the most wildly self-contradictory game franchises of all time. What is Quake? A land? A god? A tentacle queen? Single-player, multiplayer, labyrinths, death matches? After 100 hours, with all of these Quakes, the only answer I can figure is yes. It is all of these contradictions at once, and this incoherence is what makes Quake special. No matter how much time passes, we as players can always go back to that pivotal moment in 1996 when Quake stepped across the threshold into a new dimension for id Games. There is a tremendous weight and drama in these moments of extreme transition, a thrill in reliving them so long after they made their impact. There are parts when the story of Quake is complicated, and parts where it is dead simple. The beginning of any given Quake is consistent, at least. They always begin in one place, with one thing, with a shotgun, ready to rock and roll. Thanks for watching.
secondary objectives.